Linda, it looks like Kristen Sheeran needs to be elevated. Great.
Catherine, just making sure you could hear me. My audio is working?
I can, thank you, Commissioner Jackson.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'll be signing off earlier, about 11:15, but excited for a portion of the meeting.
Great, thank you. Okay. Well, I'd like to call the October 7th meeting of the Oregon Global Warming Commission to order. And we will take roll call in a few more minutes after some opening remarks so we can give people time in case they're having a little trouble signing on. I wanted to welcome Kristen Sheeran to the commission. We're just thrilled to have you on board and wanted to give you an opportunity to just introduce yourself if you'd like.
Sure, thank you. And I think, oh, my video is working. Great. I haven't used WebEx in a while. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kristen Sheeran. I'm Director of Resource Planning and Sustainability at Portland General Electric. Thrilled to be on the Oregon Global Warming Commission.
It's great to have you on board. Thank you. And then I want to also acknowledge that Matt Garrett is here representing the governor's office. So Matt, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate that. Also wanted to acknowledge that Richard Whitman has retired from DEQ. I really appreciated Richard's engagement in the commission during his tenure at DEQ, as well as his advice and counsel. We've been noticed that Colin McConaughey will be standing in for DEQ while they complete their search for a new director. And Colin will be joining us today, but not until about 11 o'clock. So, but appreciate his willingness to step in and help us with this work. I wanted to thank the public for the written comments that we received. They were distributed to commissioners prior to the meeting, and they will be considered as we move forward, completing our work and developing the roadmap. We will be taking public comment later in the meeting today, and maybe Linda, if you wouldn't mind, you or Zach, just reminding people how they can let us know that they want to testify, and then what they need to do to unmute themselves or and testify. Linda?
Yes. If you're on the phone, go ahead and hit star or hit pound or *3, and that'll raise your hand, and I can call on you then. And then if you want to unmute yourself, hit #6, and that should unmute yourself. But I will probably call on you and unmute you when you raise your hand. So #3 is what, *3 is, excuse me, I think it's *3 is what you need to do to raise your hand. So,
is that just if you're on the phone, or is that also
on the phone? If you just raise your hand, I'll be able to see you. If you're in the attendee list. So if you raise your hand, I'll call on you and unmute you.
Great. And so they don't have to unmute themselves. You'll do it for them.
Correct.
Great.
And to raise your hand, it's right down at the bottom near the emoji.
Great. Okay. I am going to attempt to do our roll call. And if I miss anyone, please let me know. Commissioner Jackson?
Present. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Sheeran, Commissioner Ford,
Present.
Commissioner Reitman,
Present.
Kelly Dundon, standing in for David Anderson.
Present.
And let's see, Brenda Bateman
Present.
and Janine Benner,
Present.
Suzanne Carlson,
Present.
next year. Commissioner Pardue,
Present.
excellent. Commissioner Decker,
Hi, good morning. I'm here.
good morning. Representative Helm,
Present. Good morning, folks.
good morning. Commissioner Apter,
Present. Good morning, all.
morning. Did I miss anyone? I don't think so. Well, good morning. Thank you all. We will, if others join a little later, we'll try and recognize them when they join. And with that, we will kick off our meeting. Today, our meeting is going to be focusing on co-benefits analysis work that we'll be doing. But maybe next slide, please, Zach. So here's an overview of our meeting. We'll do some more updates for any commissioners that want to make any comments before we dig into the co-benefits work. We'll be talking about the homework, the straw proposal and the homework that we received from commissioners. And we'll try and walk through thinking about the types of evaluation criteria, the co-benefits we want to look at and the other criteria, and then what the definitions of those are and how to weight them. So we'll kind of talk about that. And then we'll go to public comment, and then we'll come back and we'll try and finalize our decisions relative to the co-benefits analysis. We'll close that part of the meeting with an overview of what's coming next and what the schedule is for completing the roadmap and the meeting times that we'll be looking to have later this fall. And then finally, we'll give you an update at the end of the meeting on the work that the subcommittee of the commission did to select a natural and working lands advisory group. We completed that work and have noticed the folks who will be on the committee, and we can talk a little bit about that and where things stand with that natural and working lands project. That's the overview of the time today. We will take a break mid-meeting and hopefully after the public comment so that we can kind of all consider what we hear from the public and build that into our final decision making. Great. I want to also welcome Rachel Banks, Commissioner Banks, to the commission meeting. Thank you for joining us. If you want to say a few words, it's great to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I realize it may be a new face for some folks as the COVID pandemic and other public health emergencies lately have called me away. But Gabriella Goldfarb and team have done a fantastic job. I appreciate being here this morning and look forward to our conversation on co-benefits, and we'll have more to say then. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions or comments before we dive in? Any updates from commissioners?
Kathy, this is Sam. Sam
Sam.
Pardue. Hi, welcome, Commissioner I'm sorry. The formalities sometimes escape me. But I did want to say that we have a new project at Indo, which is really interesting and maybe pertinent to what our work is here on this commission, but in a very indirect way. We've begun a project with the Energy Resource Center in Colorado, where we're shipping this new framing system we developed to have the lowest possible cost window insulation solutions. This approach might also be helpful for blocking out wildfire smoke. But, not to be overly promotional here, but what I really want to bring a highlight to is I think we are also right now spending a lot of time trying to figure out what our company's response should be to the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's huge amounts of money that are going to flow through energy efficiency programs for low and middle income communities, and also big tax incentives for homeowners to do energy efficiency measures. And so the question I have, which is very relevant, is over there in Colorado, we have something going that's very interesting. It's a very new way to insulate windows at a very low cost. But here in Oregon, we don't have anything. So I want to try and figure out how we can solve that. But I also want to ask that the commission maybe begin to think about how the state should be acting to leverage the IRA to the maximum extent. And that's really the key message.
Yeah, it's a great point, Commissioner Pardue. I think while some information is still coming out about how that money will flow, I think it would make a lot of sense for us to have the relevant agencies kind of speak to, what that's going to mean for their work and for our work going forward. So I'm glad you raised that, and I'll work with the staff at Odo to make sure we can pull some of that information together. So
I think it could really maybe even change some of the math that's been done around what the relative contribution of various sectors could be, because, if the state put a little breath behind making sure everybody in Oregon knew how to get into these, qualify for these tax credits, and, it could be a really good job builder as well as a way to highly leverage somebody else's money.
Great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Are there other updates that commissioners want to provide? Let's see. Commissioner Bateman, or Director Bateman, excuse me.
Good morning, everyone. Brenda Bateman here, Director of the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I just wanted to note for your information that we have 4 updates that are on our website, on our homepage under latest news that you might want to check out. They're all relevant to the conversation we're going to have here today, so I'm very excited about today's agenda. But we have a set of new wildfire recommendations specifically pointed at land use, so they're very narrow with regard to wildfire, but those are now up on our website, and we have sent those over to the legislature that required us to submit that by October 1st. We also have a draft set of housing recommendations. The comment period on that's already closed, but those are there and available for you if you'd like to see them. We'll be incorporating everything we heard and submitting those recommendations to the legislature by the end of the year. We also, our commission, I think I noted this in our last meeting, adopted its climate-friendly and equitable communities rules over the summer. So that was in July, and those have now been posted or filed with the Secretary of State. And that link is on our latest news and announcements. And then finally, we're part of the Mass Timber Coalition that was recently awarded grant funding from the EDA. And so the details about that coalition, the use of mass timber to create jobs and to address housing is also in that section. So I'm happy to take any questions, but we've got a lot going on. We're pretty excited about it, and all of those details are up on our website now.
Thank you so much, Director Bateman. Director Benner.
Thank you, Chair McDonald. Along those lines, I'll share a couple things that have happened at the Oregon Department of Energy recently. We were assigned a number of studies by the 2021 legislative session, and some of those studies were published this month. So On September 15th, we released a floating offshore wind study looking at the benefits and challenges to integrating up to 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind off Oregon's coast by 2030. So thinking about what role offshore wind may have in our state's efforts to meet our clean energy and climate goals. At the end of the month, we released a report on small scale and community-based renewable energy projects to help provide a foundation for understanding how these types of projects could support Oregon communities and our climate and energy goals. We're currently working on 2 studies that will be coming out soon. One is the Biennial Energy Report. So every 2 years, this report comes out November 1st. We're in the final throes of putting that report together, and I'm excited to potentially present it to the commission at some point this fall. And then another study that will come out in November is our renewable hydrogen study. So looking at the potential benefits of and barriers to production and use of renewable hydrogen in Oregon. So all of those studies are on our website. I'm happy to put links in the chat, but hopefully they can be some good resources for commission members and members of the public who are interested in those topics.
That's great. I know your staff has been working really hard on all these reports. So thanks for all the great work.
It's been a busy fall.
Just looking to see if anyone else has their hand up. Representative Helm.
Hey, thank you, Chair McDonald. I just wanted to chime in right now for our agencies that are providing studies on time and doing work that we asked them to do over the interim. I just want to express appreciation. These are such critical pieces of information for us to have to make good decisions. And I know it's not easy. We put you under some time pressure, and in certain instances, we didn't give you additional money for staff. So I just wanted to express my thanks to you for doing such good work, and I'm excited to see all the outcomes that are coming at us. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Helm. Great. Okay. Well, with that, I think we are ready to jump into our overview of incorporating co-benefits. So you'll go to the next slide, please. Just a quick reminder of where we are in the process of developing the roadmap. We are getting near the end. This integration of the co-benefits and will give us another data point to consider as we, or set of data points to consider as we identify goals, the scenarios that we want to recommend and the specific actions, and to think about how we the urgency of different actions based on both the greenhouse gas benefits and costs that we got to look at from the MAC curves last time, but also thinking about the way that we can provide additional benefits or co-benefits in our work. So that's the order of business today. Next slide. So we will be digging in to talk about the categories of co-benefits and other evaluation criteria that we will use to assess the actions. And that's going to be a bit of a complicated conversation because some of the proposed revisions intersect with each other. So it'll be a little challenging to work through the definitions part. And then I think it should be pretty easy for us to tackle the rest. Once we've completed this, then the staff at the Department of Energy will go ahead and score all the actions, and that information will be available to us for our deliberation at our next meeting, where we're going to start to talk about those goals, scenarios, and the actions that we want to recommend to the legislature and the governor. Next slide. Alan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chair McDonald. So there are, of course, 2 scenarios that we put forward. One's called electrification, and one was initially called alternative fuels. But what we found was the alternative fuels one, which was supposed to be predominantly renewable natural gas, RNG, and hydrogen, that the modeling that we had done showed that we could not make the scenario work just with those fuels. So there had to be a lot of crossover with the electrification scenario as well. So these programs here are the ones that are common to both scenarios. Both are they're in both scenarios, and they make up a big chunk of what's in both scenarios. So there's a great amount of overlap or common actions in both scenarios. I won't read them all, but next slide. Yeah, in this slide, Kathy, are you muted?
I was muted, apologies. Yeah, if you could go back one slide and then maybe explain the asterisks that we have on the landfill program and the Recycling Modernization Act.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, the two programs, the Recycling Modernization Act and Landfill Program, are two programs that were adopted by rule through DEQ and the EQC. And so we're actually taking those and putting them into the group of actions that have that are businesses planned or programs or regulations already adopted, along with CPP in 2001 and a lot of the other programs that we've gone over in previous meetings. So we're going to add those in up there instead, because they are actually rules that have been adopted by the EQC.
Thank you. So that's just a bit of an adjustment based on a conversation that we had with DEQ that made us aware that those two programs are in a place where they should be moved over to to kind of what's already in place and taken out of the scenarios to help us get further from there.
Right. And relatively speaking to both the two big lever programs, the CPP and HB 2021, they're relatively small compared to those two, but everything is. Next slide, Zach. So that kind of prompts the question of, well, what's different between the two scenarios? And there are these handful of programs then that make up the difference between the electrification and the hybrid scenario. And in the electrification, it relies more on things that are going to electrify non-heating equipment, so appliances, more solar on buildings and on rooftops, storage, replacing diesel backup with electric battery storage, and another one which was electrifying industry and being able to do that. That one's a tough road to hoe, but that's by 2050. On the hybrid side, use the RNG and the hydrogen, we assumed that we could potentially get 70% green hydrogen in industry by 2050 as the counterpart to the 70% electrification in 2050. We could use the full potential that we think is available by 2050 of RNG. That includes imports from other neighboring states, not just confined to our indigenous capability to create RNG. And there would be the pipeline would get an injection of 15% hydrogen by 2035. 5% of homes would end up with fuel cells powered by hydrogen by 2030, and 5% of fuel from biomass by 2035. So those are the basic differences between the two scenarios, and frankly, all 11 of these could move forward and help us meet the goals. Some of them are kind of mutually exclusive, but not all. The industry use of electrification or hydrogen is, but not too many of the others. Next slide. Yeah, again, where we ended up with at the end of the last session was the MAC curve. And again, a MAC curve is a visual representation of the cost effectiveness of different actions that we're taking, and also a visual representation of how much they save in terms or reduce in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So the zero line through the middle of the graph is cost and benefits are equal. If the bar drops below the line, that means there's savings, and if it goes above the line, that means there's a cost. The width of the line is how much reductions in greenhouse gases there are. This represents not every single action in the two scenarios. Some of them we have a hard time nailing down exact costs, but it represents the vast majority of them. If you were basically just going to do a economic based plan, you would go from left to right, or most cost effective to least cost effective, and kind of implement them in that order or in that rough order. But what we're trying to do with the co-benefits incorporation into the evaluation criteria is not only consider how much greenhouse gases are being reduced and what their cost is, dollars per metric ton, but the other co-benefits, and that's what we're trying to do. And that could rejigger the order of this, so that pink bar in the middle there that's just slightly below could move up, for instance, and then it could be a higher priority, even though it might not be the highest priority based on cost effectiveness. It could be based on when you consider cost effectiveness plus the co-benefits. Next slide, Zach.
Ellen, there's a question about what the retrofits include.
So yeah, so the two bars on the far left or right, sorry, the yellow and the blue ones, are the retrofits for commercial and retrofits for residential. That is just basically envelope retrofits. So trying to retrofit walls, floors, ceilings, windows, doors, all of that stuff. That tends to be very expensive to do and difficult to do, more so than if you were to do it on the other end of the MAC curve, which are the new commercial building code and the residential code are both on that end of the curve. That's doing it at construction. So in the energy efficiency business, one of the things that is talked about in terms of being able to put things in code is a concept called a lost opportunity. In some cases, it's very difficult to actually you can't really take apart a wall and make it take a 2x4 wall and make it 2x6 wall and add more insulation. So if you don't do that at construction, it's so expensive to do, it's really a lost opportunity. So there's that aspect of it, but there's also just the cost associated with doing the retrofit of the envelope. That makes those two on the far right expensive, and the ones on the far left cheap.
Thank you.
The next slide, actually the same MAC curve, but for the hybrid scenario. You can see it's very similar in its shape and actually in its composition. And again, not every single one of the measures is in here, but the ones that we had good cost for that we could rely on are in this one. Next slide. Oh, there's there's a comment in the chat. Kathy, did you see that?
Yes. Oh, I think it's just a readability comment. Thank you for that input. We'll try and improve that.
Yeah, make that line darker so you can see it.
And larger font.
To keep going, what the process overview for incorporation of co-benefits. So this is just an overview of where we've been and where we're at and where we're heading with this. So the
Alan, apologies for the interruption. Commissioner Pardue had a comment relevant to the last slide, couple of slides. Commissioner Pardue?
Go back one, Zach.
Well, I was just, there's a fair amount of innovation going on in the secondary glazing space, and the United States Department of Energy actually identified secondary glazing as the third largest source of potential energy efficiency of any measure at all out of 400. But the prices are really coming down, and that's what we're trying to do in this weatherization assistance program in Colorado. Is we have a solution that has a savings to investment ratio that actually qualifies, it satisfies the need. So, and in the commercial business space, the typical desire is for a 5 to 7 year payback on energy efficiency measures, which is this insanely difficult target to meet as a company because it's kind of a rule of thumb that makes no sense. And I think there's really a very interesting role that government could play to get commercial building owners to want to make investments with a 10 to 14 year payback period. And that would actually dramatically revolutionize private investment in energy efficiency. So I just wanted to kind of put those ideas out there that I think there's a lot of change happening because I think the incentives in the marketplace are driving the innovation. And government can have a big part of that.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Commissioner Pardue. We can maybe
I know
circle
that
back to you and talk more about that offline.
I know that Chris and Yule, our modelers from SSG, have done such great work or online, and maybe they can talk in a second about, and Linda, maybe you want to promote Chris, but they can talk about cost over time. But I totally agree with that assessment. That's why the bars on the far right are rather wide. They do represent a great amount of potential reduction in greenhouse gases and energy efficiency. And then as to costs, our costs are mostly a snapshot. And maybe Yule and Chris, one of you could talk about what we did with all of these measures in terms of cost over time.
I can speak to that. Should I jump in?
Yes, please do, Yule.
Okay, so these costs represent annual investments in the building stock. So it's the sum of the cumulative sum of investments over the study period, as well as the cumulative sum of savings over the study period, all summed up and then discounted back to the present year. So that's how you get that cost. There are trajectories in terms of energy costs that are represented in here, both and also capital costs, and those are not held flat. So, for example, retrofit costs decline as a learning curve, not significantly, and the energy costs are also moving. And I think the other point to note with the marginal abatement or an abatement cost curve like this is that this doesn't show the dynamics between different measures. And when we model the integrated scenario, we do capture those dynamics. So, for example, if you do a retrofit like this, like the bars you see at the far right, that will increase the thermal performance of the building, which then means that the heat pumps are cheaper to install because you don't need as big a heat pump. Plus, the operational energy for a heat pump is lower. And so when you start to integrate all those together, the economic outcome is very different than when you look at it like you see in this chart, which is as an individual measure. So that integration, I think, is a really important component and a real limitation of the abatement cost curve. I don't know if that's what you were looking for, Alan, but hopefully that hit it.
Yes, very good. So it is a snapshot. Another example of the integration model and how it works is in the transportation sector. So when we assume that the CPP and the Clean Fuels program all start reducing the carbon intensity of fuel, gasoline, diesel, when the next increment of EVs actually reduce less and less greenhouse gases because the fuels are getting better and better. So an EV put in place in 2034 doesn't save the amount of greenhouse gases that one is put in 2024 because of that integrative aspect of the model. So it's a dynamic model. So another way to say that is what you put in first in the model matters, and how it trickles down into how it affects other measures. And so we're careful and thoughtful about how we integrate those things. And that's why we did in particular, that's why we did the programs and regulations adopted, or businesses plan. All those actions need to be in place before we start doing these, because they interact. And so how we do some of these things and what happens to the electricity, for instance, with HB 2021 being 100% electric by 2040, impacts these as well. So while the cost doesn't change, the energy and savings and the greenhouse gas emission reductions does change over time.
And so just to emphasize the point that this is just one piece of information that the commission, these MAC curves is just one piece of information for us to consider. All of this is a lot more complicated when you start to think about how they all interact. And so that needs to be part of our deliberation going forward, is just thinking about that and just, taking this for what we can learn from it, but not being so wed to it that we're not making the best recommendations.
Can I just have
Yeah.
one final follow-up? And this kind of also speaks to the amount of, as we consider investments needed, it also, which is the net cost part of the equation, the other part of that is who is actually paying. And if we can leverage, for instance, the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act and get homeowners to voluntarily invest in their own homes to make them more energy efficient, then we can get a huge return for a relatively small cost if we can figure out how to leverage those federal dollars appropriately. And I'm also observing here, just looking at the opposite ends of this spectrum, the impacts, we may discover that the non-financial impacts really may be almost inversely to this graph here, because if you can improve someone's home, the comfort of that home, and you can reduce the energy bills that they're paying and reduce energy poverty, you may be having the very biggest and very positive impacts on health are possible as well through these residential retrofits. So I'm looking forward to it. It's a very complex question.
Well, that was a great segue, I think.
Yul had his hand up. You wanted to add something, Yul?
I guess I was just going to add as well that in a paradigm where every ton of carbon counts, the co-benefits also become another justification, but you also have to figure out how to make, like, you can't just sort of pick the cheapest or the most cost-effective actions. It's really about optimizing the whole system. So can you combine policies or actions that save money with those that don't save money to get a package that will make sense financially? Or can you leverage other benefits, like you're talking about, where people are doing a retrofit to their home anyway, and the incremental cost is not so large. So it's just an additional benefit to an expenditure that they were going to make in any case. So those are kind of the lenses that we've been thinking about a lot in terms of enabling all of these policies to happen through the lens of really every ton counting, whether it's an expensive ton or a cheap ton. How do you get them all done? And that's, I think, the other part of this story of this abatement curve, is that you're trying to get all the emissions on here. You're not just picking some of them. Emissions reductions, rather.
Right. That's a very good point. And I'll just reiterate that all of these need to be done in order to meet the accelerated target. So what this does is help us figure out the rough priority order of how to do that. Hopefully, when you get to the far right side of the least cost-effective side of the graph, things have changed so that the costs come down, or that we have to do less of that. But it's a rough priority. It's not necessarily a prescriptive path where you do the blue one first and you don't do anything until you're done with that, and then you do the red one, and then you don't do anything with that. You need champions for these. You need to be able to move on a lot of them over a broad time frame. But this is if you're going to tackle things and put them forward and champion them, it makes sense to do the ones on the left side of the screen first as we move forward, because those are the biggest bang for the buck. One more comment about the incentives that Commissioner Perdue brought forward. This is a total cost model. So we assume that the cost of the measure is embedded in here. The cost of implementing the measure, the direct cost of doing that. So whether the state provides an incentive or the customer provides an incentive or provides some of the cost, it's still part of the cost to Oregon. The IRA passed when we were done with all of the modeling. So the IRA benefits that that are going to accrue to some of these actions are not going to be in this model because it literally passed after we were done. And it's still unclear exactly how that's all going to play out. But we've said multiple times that the Tigger project is a snapshot and it will be done on a periodic basis. Hopefully every 2 years, we'll be able to incorporate a lot of the changes that occur in some of the federal incentives, which aren't an Oregon cost, which make things cheaper. We'll have a discussion about those costs and be able to incorporate new data associated with these actions as well.
And also, this is just one data point. We're gonna talk about another data point to Commissioner Pardue's point. Once we start thinking about co-benefits,
Yep.
They shift a lot.
Next slide, Zach. So this is where we've been and where we're heading. We did list the initial ideas for co-benefits and evaluation criteria throughout the process. We've been talking about that since the very beginning. We took all that data and put together the straw proposal, which we sent out to the commission for some homework. And thank you for all those that responded to that and put some thought into that. It'll make for a better conversation today. And today we're going to be talking about with the commission and have a discussion about those kind of co-benefits and the other evaluation criteria. And we're going to end up selecting a set of evaluation criteria that we want to use in the scoring and ranking, as well as defining those so we have a better, clearer, more detailed picture of what that evaluation criteria means and how it's supposed to be scored. And then we're going to we end up with 5 or 6 of them. We're going to take a 100-point scale and allocate those points to the evaluation criteria that the commission finally comes up with. And because not all evaluation criteria are created equal, some of them will have different weightings. And that's what we showed in the homework and people thought about. Once we've got that data from you today, so the end product today is the evaluation criteria, their definitions, and the weighting. So that will be able to take ODO staff will be able to take that and score each of the actions in comparison to the other actions, because we're trying to differentiate them to get more of a comparison of them to then use those evaluation criteria and the weights to then score each of the actions. And then once we have a total score, then we can rank them. And that will come up with yet another data point like Commissioner McDonald was talking about. And this data point will be the MAC curve, but it'll be MAC curve with the co-benefits included in the prioritization order. So at the end, we'll have 2 very helpful data points for the commission. 1, the purely economic MAC curve, and 2, the reprioritization of the actions with incorporating the co-benefits into their score.
Alan, just a quick, I want to welcome Commissioner Magnera to the meeting today, and also want to welcome Sierra Watson from Senator Finley's office. Thank you for joining us.
Great, welcome. So again, just to reiterate what we're trying to do today, by the end of the day, we want to agree on what the co-benefits and other co-evaluation criteria we are going to use to do the scoring and the ranking. And we want to have as clear as we can, a definition, sort of the details of what does it mean to be cost effective or whatever the evaluation criteria is. And then once we have all of those, we'll be weighting them using that 100-point scale. So there'll be a little bit of math. Sorry for those folks that you don't like that, but it has to total up to 100. And of course, as we go through this, it's kind of a dynamic process. We've done this many times, but it's kind of hard to separate the weighting from the criteria and the definitions. So they kind of you talk about them at the same time, but necessarily we have to have a sequential thing where we clarify what the criteria are, what their definition, and then we'll weight them. But it's totally okay to talk about how important something is when you're talking about it and whether or not it's going to make much of a difference. Next slide, Zach.
Thank you, Alan. Does anybody have any questions about the process?
It's going to be fun.
Okay, we'll dig in.
Next slide, Zach. So when we do talk about and think about the co-benefits and other evaluation criteria, there's things to be considerate that we want to take into consideration. So we're going to be using these evaluation criteria to score the actions. So we're actually trying to compare the actions within the group of actions and not in an abstract sense. We're trying to figure out which one's the best and which one's the worst for that particular criteria. And so when we do that, we will create what are called scoring bins. And if there's 20 points for that criteria, the best one will get 20 points and the worst one will get 0 to 5. And then we'll try to fit all the other ones in between. Again, the point is to distinguish them from one another so we can reprioritize the ranking. And so when we do that, it's very important to have evaluation criteria that help us actually do that. If for instance, a criteria has very low or de minimis impact, or basically all of them have pretty close to the same amount of that particular criteria, that wouldn't be a particularly critical or helpful evaluation criteria co-benefit. So another way to say that is, while something could be really an important thing when we're into consideration of climate change and the actions we need to take, it may not be that useful in helping distinguish between them. So in our scoring and ranking process. So we want to be mindful of that. If we think of an evaluation criteria, like for instance, we didn't include resilience in the straw proposal because we believe that every single one of the actions in the list create resilience, and it would be very difficult to actually distinguish the resilience benefits of one versus the other, but we can have that conversation if people think differently. But so it wasn't a very particularly useful criteria, but it's super, super important to have resilience as a benefit associated with all of those actions, but not necessarily helpful in distinguishing amongst the group. So the other,
Alan, just trying to get my arms around thinking about how we're going to be making recommendations and the information that we're going to be providing decision makers and the public about all these actions. And I understand your point that maybe something doesn't distinguish the actions that much because they may all have the same relative benefit. But it seems like we do want to talk about all the co-benefits. And so I guess I'm trying to, are we sending a message if we say, you know, a certain co-benefit's not going to be used in the ranking? Are we kind of suggesting that we think that's less important in, you know, consideration of how we move forward in implementing these things?
right, again, distinguish between a climate change really important factor for actions that reduce greenhouse gases that with criteria that help us distinguish and rank the actions within the group. Another example might be environmental impacts are a huge and very, very important, and there's air, land, and water impacts. We do have identified the by proxy using the EPA COBRA model, we have identified the health impacts by reduced criteria pollution of each of the actions. So we know what those are. But when we started talking about like the impact on land, almost all of the projects or actions in the list are on existing buildings or on an existing footprint and don't really actually have that much of an impact on the land. And so it wasn't a particularly useful criteria for distinguishing among the group of actions, but it's still an incredibly important thing to think about in the context of climate change. What are the air, land, and water impacts? So if we can distinguish between the ranking criteria and overall importance of what things do in the climate change space, that'd be very helpful.
So we can make sure that we're messaging this, that the selection of the evaluation criteria is not a reflection of all of the important things that we should be thinking about as we think about this. It was just a way to have us be able to kind of see differences between some of the actions.
Right.
I don't want us to send a message saying that, you know, some of those things are less important.
Correct. Right. It's a reprioritization exercise as opposed to these things are really important exercise. Once we do have those evaluation criteria and co-benefits selected, I'll skip to the last one. We do want to have a manageable number. We don't want to have it. Having done this about a dozen times, if you have a manageable number of them, it makes for a more coherent process, but it also makes the work of the staff a little bit easier to do, more manageable and less complicated. And when things are less complicated, they can actually add clarity to the process. So we do want to have a manageable number. We don't want to have an infinite number. And how we define the evaluation criteria, once we've figured out what the evaluation criteria, the 5 or 6 of them that we have, what does it mean when you say health benefits? What does it mean that it's not only the COBRA modeling dollar estimates, but also increasing quality of life or other kinds of health benefits associated with it? So we want to have a robust discussion about what those bullet points are in the next column over to the right on the other side of the evaluation criteria that help us define it. And when we do the scoring, we'll use those definitional bullet points to help score and rank order the actions within the group comparatively against each other.
Great, thank you.
Any questions on that? Slide, Zach. So we did have a robust conversation since the beginning of this project, which is only about a year ago, but seems longer, where we talked about a whole list of co-benefits that we've listed here. And then we also have other evaluation criteria. Again, we're trying to compare amongst the group. So things like cost effectiveness, the amount of greenhouse emission reduction, and the risk and uncertainty aren't necessarily co-benefits. They're other evaluation criteria, but they're important when you're trying to score each of the actions and compare them within the group. So not having cost effectiveness, for instance, be part of that of the scoring would leave out a very important part of the information about a particular action. Same with the greenhouse gas reduction amount. Just wanted to touch a little more on risk and uncertainty. So the risk and uncertainty is the risk and uncertainty associated with the action actually occurring the way we think it's going to occur. So it's do we think it's going to get the amount of reduction we estimated, and do we think it's going to cost what we think it's going to cost? if that's in doubt, then that one would get a lower score than one where we have lots of experience and we know we can get that particular greenhouse gas reduction amount at a particular price. So that's what risk and uncertainty means. It's really the ability or our assessment of how certain we are about the action being played out as we planned it or estimated it.
Alan, given that we're looking at these as data points, information, could you make the argument that we've already got an assessment of cost effectiveness and greenhouse gas reduction in the MAC curve? So what are the arguments against just having a co-benefits data point and leaving those two out?
Yeah, I guess the argument would be that having cost effectiveness, dollars per metric ton reduced, and the amount not included in the co-benefits analysis, or not included in the scoring, would have a very different. We could do that, and certainly we can do that by reordering the what as a sensitivity analysis and show that data point as well. So we can do both actually, but I would argue that those three things on the right there, the other evaluation criteria, are important to have a credible resorting priorities based on a bunch of different factors other than just purely economic.
So really what we're producing is kind of not a different data point, but a combined data point of the initial MAC curve plus a co-benefits. So that's something for us to think about.
Next slide, Zach.
So Chair McDonald, several of us have had our hands up, so I don't know.
Apologies.
Yeah.
Thank you for jumping in. Unfortunately, you don't, when your hand comes up, you don't necessarily move over to the view that I have. So I apologize. So if people have their hand up, do just jump in.
So so I just had a quick question about the risk and uncertainty. Does that risk and uncertainty apply to the co-benefits themselves? Right, because I'm just curious, like, do we know how certain are we about the jobs impact? How certain are we about that we're going to create access to programs with these actions? And so is there risk and uncertainty associated with the co-benefits as part of this, or is that separate?
That's not how we put it in the straw proposal, but Commissioner Ford, that certainly can be part of the way we think about it. So the next part of the process that we're going to do is we're going to go through and talk about each of these things and what they mean. So I would hold that point in advance because I think it's a really good point.
Commissioner Magnera?
Yeah, thank you. I think maybe asking a similar version of the question that David just did. How are you weighing kind of risk and uncertainty for the people who will benefit from the co-benefits, like an unintended consequences type element of that work? And then how are you also thinking about some of the interactions of the co-benefits, not just as they apply to analysis, but just understanding that many communities, things are not siloed into jobs and energy burden and social equity, but tend to be very interrelated. So it sometimes can be challenging to disaggregate co-benefits, although I think this is a list that's a good start.
Commissioner Magnera, I think that's the challenge we're going to have as we wrestle with the definitions, because you will see that they kind of point to each other. So we can kind of dig back into that more specifically as we start to discuss the definitions.
Right. I would just reiterate or build on that when we start the discussion, you'll instantly see that there are parts of one criteria that affect other criteria, and they're all interrelated. So actually, a good set of evaluation criteria will be interrelated, and they'll have they'll have interactions as well, and you know the cost, effectiveness, and social equity interrelationships. But in the scoring process of trying to rank them and trying to quantify the qualitative parts of this, which is what this exercise is really going to be partially about, it's important to kind of distinguish them, and that's why the definitions will be very important. Understanding that there's interrelationships.
Commissioner Sharon?
Yes, hi. Ellen, I'm sorry if you explained this and I just didn't get it, but I have two questions. So one, with respect to cost effectiveness, is the goal here to put, you know, a dollar value on all the co-benefits and to include them in the cost effectiveness, or is the cost effectiveness measure more of a direct cost of acquiring those reductions, you know, per ton of carbon? Well, I'll let you answer that one first, and then I'll get to my second question.
Okay. Good. Thank you for that. So the proposal in the straw proposal was to use the MAC curve analysis, the degree that we add that information to look at the dollars per metric ton reduced. So we have fairly accurate, we think, estimates of that, and that's what we intended for cost effectiveness to be. And plus, we can add other things into it. And for those where we have ranges of costs where we weren't actually certain, that's where the scoring bins come into place. So we don't know exactly how much it's going to cost, but or have good certainty around that, but we have pretty good certainty around it. So we'll be able to put it into the bin and say, okay, it's higher than this one, but lower than this one, so it fits here in the ranking.
But just to clarify then, so the co-benefits are not going to be used to estimate cost effectiveness?
Except for health and benefits, which we do have cost on, correct.
Okay. And then with regards to the list of the potential co-benefits, is there an intent at any point to sort of sum them together for sort of a full value of co-benefit? Because it seems to me that there's some overlap between them. So for example, when I look at the social cost of carbon, depending upon which social cost of carbon, you know, we utilize, that is already going to embed some health impacts, some quality of life, and some of these other issues that are reflected on the list. So how do we avoid double counting if the intent is to aggregate at any point?
Right. So we could do the analysis once we're done. We can have the other evaluation criteria listed here be included and do analysis with just on the co-benefits and see what happens when we do that. That's a good analysis to do. So we'll be able to incorporate or adjust a co-benefits type of analysis. But with regard to the social cost of carbon, we didn't calculate the social cost of carbon on each of the individual actions. We did it on the entire thing, in part because we don't know what the social cost of carbon means. What is the global avoided harm that occurs by doing this action? And so we can't identify with any precision the avoided harm in Oregon. And so we didn't do that for each individual action, but we did it on the overall both of the scenarios, and I forget exactly how much each one of them were, but it was a substantial amount of avoided harm by doing this package that added to the net benefit of the overall package, but not the individual actions.
But Alan, I think the question was more, you know, if we are going to consolidate these, how do we avoid the overlap? And I think we've selected a subset, which is what we'll get to next. And I think we would want to make sure we aren't doing a lot of double counting by including the social cost of carbon as an example, and with other things. So Alan, I think I just heard you say that doing an analysis that just looks at co-benefits would be something we could do as well.
Yep.
Okay. So if we do that, then we'll want to think about the criteria that we select.
Yeah, and Commissioner Sheeran, your question actually goes directly to how important the definition bullets are. And the clearer that you guys are in coming up with those, the more able we are to not have a dramatic overlap and have them as much as possible, which is almost impossible, to have them discrete.
Thank you.
Any other questions for?
Mr. Reitman has a question.
Excellent. Commissioner Reitman?
I just wanted to back up a little bit and encourage us to not minimize the impact on land from these scenarios. Like, for example, the solar arrays that are being built are in the thousands of acres, and so I think some of that's not been really fully accounted for, the loss of farmland and the impact on the local community.
Very good point, Commissioner Reitman, and that's very, very true if we were considering HB 2021, which will have utility scale large ones. We're seeing huge swaths of land being engulfed in these. The actions in particular that we're talking about, all the solar would be on buildings. There are no solar actions that aren't on buildings, so there actually be no land impacts from this particular set of actions. Again, there certainly are in the larger set of actions, especially as utilities try to comply with HB 2021.
Sure, yeah, that all of these actions that change to using electricity require some form of renewable energy production. So
yes,
so it's all related.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Reitman. Okay.
I don't see any more questions.
I don't either. Go to the next slide.
So the straw proposal that we pulled together a set of evaluation criteria, 6 of them, and tried to get at what the definitions are, the bullets, and then also the weighting. We'll put aside the weighting for a second and focus on the evaluation criteria. So these are the evaluation criteria that basically the consultants, Zach, myself, and Kathy came together and put forward as a straw proposal, not to start the conversation. It's always better to have something to take target practice at than it is to create from whole cloth. So we wanted to be able to put something forward to be able to then modify, which is a much faster process and easier process for a large group to go through than to create from scratch. So we did choose cost effectiveness, greenhouse gas emissions, and risk uncertainty, those other evaluation criteria. And then we added in the co-benefits of health, jobs, and economic prosperity and equity. And then we tried to define them through these more detailed bullet points of what exactly does that mean. And then we allocated what we thought would be an appropriate amount of points or weighting for each of those evaluation criteria. Our job today is to modify this proposal to either add or subtract from the evaluation criteria on the far left, add or subtract from the definitions depending on what the evaluation criteria are, and then in the end come up with the weighting associated with it. Again, math exercise, we need to have it be totaling 100 points.
Great.
And this was the homework exercise, by the way, that was sent out.
Zach, you're going to walk us through what came in from the homework assignments now? Is that right?
That's right, Chair McDonald. Good morning, commissioners. Really appreciate those who provided the homework. I'm gonna try to walk through some of the responses, give you an overview of what we heard. We received 7 responses from 5 voting members and 2 non-voting members. We got a variety of edits to the straw proposal, including criteria additions, criteria definition changes to all but one of the criteria. The greenhouse gas emissions reduction amount was the one that folks did not change definitions on. And then we also had a variety of scoring weight changes from commissioners. And then there were just a number of questions, some of which have already come up in the discussion so far this morning. So there's a lot for the commission to discuss and work through just based on the homework responses. And towards that end, we've tried to organize the slides that follow to give you a sense of the specific comments and highlight some of the key points for discussion. I'll walk through the comments at a pretty high level, and don't worry too much about digesting everything on the slides at the moment. They're a little bit busy, and we did that for a reason so that we could potentially come back to these as we work our way through each of the pieces of discussion. So I'll first start with comments on the list of the criteria, then go through comments on each of the specific criteria in the straw proposal, and then give you a sense of the different weighting commissioners suggested. So on the first on the list of criteria, there was general agreement on the list of the straw proposal criteria. You can see those in the highlighted in blue there. But there were also 2 additional criteria suggested. One was resilience, and you can see how that was defined. And then the other one was avoided risks and associated costs. And again, the definition is there for you. At the same time, there was also a commissioner who suggested not adding more criteria because it potentially would diminish the weight of those that are already in the straw proposal. So definitely a fair amount to discuss there on additions. And then for now kind of walking through each of the criteria that were in the straw proposal, on cost effectiveness, one commissioner suggested including cost savings from stranded assets, and also suggested adding whether there are existing incentives like federal tax credits. Another commissioner noted that they thought cost effectiveness is important, but not the most important criteria. Moving on to the next one on risk and uncertainty. One commissioner suggested that in addition to whether cost effectiveness and greenhouse gas emission reductions actually materialize, whether emissions reductions can be measured should be part of this criteria. And then another commissioner raised questions of whether this criteria, which mentions cost effectiveness in the definition, is repetitive with the cost effectiveness criteria that I just went through in the previous slide. And another commissioner had questions about how this risk and uncertainty criteria will be measured, and so wanted some further discussion. And again, some of that already had started this morning. And just a quick note on these slides, I bolded a couple of places to hopefully help the topics pop for you as we're going through these. It's not an emphasis per se of whether we agree or not. It's just to help with readability. And then as you can see, I've put underlines in the definition of where folks decided to add, and you'll see as we move through there will also be cross-throughs for where folks decided to or were interested in deleting some places. So the next criteria was on the health co-benefit. And this is the first one where we had multiple commissioners offer language edits. Each box here represents the respective commissioner's suggestions. So it's also organized by kind of extent of the edits to the straw proposal. So in the top box, one commissioner suggested considering indoor air pollution in addition to outdoor air pollution, and also expanding the list of illnesses to consider health savings from including respiratory illnesses and cancer. In the bottom box, another commissioner proposed combining some of the items that were originally in the health co-benefit language and adding new items in. So first, the commissioner suggested referring to the co-benefit as quality of life / health co-benefit, and then proposed a definition that included reduction in air pollutants and comfort, which are both mentioned in the existing straw proposal language, but also added in consideration of a more efficient building envelope and preserving energy choice for consumers into the definition. The next co-benefit, jobs and economic prosperity, had a lot of comment, and so we'll work our way through this. This time, 3 commissioners weighed in with language changes. In the top box, you can see a commissioner suggested explicitly mentioning cost decreases from the use of electric appliances, as well as benefits associated with shielding Oregonians from fossil fuel price volatility. In the middle box, another commissioner suggested that in addition to job creation, include consideration of the existing jobs preserved or expanded. And then the commissioner also suggested including business and societal resiliency measured by least amount of downtime or and lost days. And finally, the commissioner suggested including consideration of increased energy efficiency. In the last box here, one of the commissioners suggested taking measurement of jobs out of this criteria and instead referring to it as an economic prosperity co-benefit, and then just made the definition into one bullet with building energy and transportation costs included. And then if you move over to the right here, there are additional commissioner comments on the topic on the side that mention commissioners thought that there was some overlap with the same benefit for equity. There was a suggestion to reduce the weight of this particular criteria, and a notation that one of the commissioners supported creating jobs, but didn't think this was as important as the other co-benefits. So that kind of gives you a landscape of a number of the issues that came up on this particular criteria. And then to the next criteria is on equity. And one commissioner suggested adding in consideration of avoided future energy burden from expanded gas infrastructure and investments in certain alternative fuels. And then another commissioner suggested removing the first bullet in the straw proposal regarding underserved populations. And other commissioners suggested broadening the definition to include other greenhouse gas or household costs, such as transportation, energy, and potentially housing. And then finally, another commissioner suggested specifically mentioning that underserved communities include rural and frontier parts of Oregon. So that gives you a sense of criteria by criteria, what folks were thinking. And then there were a number of kind of cross-cutting or overall commissioner comments that I just wanted to get on your radar screen. And again, we can come back to these. I know this is a busy slide, but there was some concern about duplication across and within criteria. So one commissioner suggested reducing overlap between the prosperity for all and the equity for underserved populations criteria. There's a suggestion to maybe emphasize health benefits that accrue more to burdened populations, potentially using the social cost of carbon in place of some of the measurements. And then there was a suggestion to weight maybe the weighting could water down greenhouse gas impacts as compared to co-benefits. And so to think about that as the criteria is being developed. There were also a number of notations about questions about the interplay between health, jobs, and equity co-benefits. There was also a note that folks had questions and concerns about how actions that involve pricing could potentially not do as well if economic benefits are emphasized, and pricing being, in their opinion, an important tool as part of many of these actions. And then there was a suggestion that the health and jobs, equity, prosperity criteria focus on human population or that these criteria as written currently focus on human populations in the present era, and maybe there is potential to describe co-benefits to the natural environment and other species, and also consider a longer time horizon in the definitions of the criteria. And then finally, this comment came up earlier in our conversation. Another commissioner mentioned that there are co-harms as well, such as covering up good agricultural land with solar panels. So that really kind of wraps up the language changes. I've got 2 more slides here, and then we'll pause. The next one is on the different weightings the commissioners suggested, and then a potential ordering of how to work through all of the topics and issues that have been brought up just via the homework. So on the commissioner weighting, this chart shows each of the commissioners' proposed weightings, and these are initial weightings. They haven't had the benefit of the conversation that will ensue today. And so in blue on the left are the straw proposal criteria and the proposed straw weighting. And then as you can see, moving from left to right, so there was one commissioner who supported the entire straw proposal weighting. And then the rest of the commissioners had different allocations for how to do the weighting for these particular criteria. And just from the first criteria, looking at cost effectiveness, if you look across the row, you can see that there was a pretty big difference among the commissioners. Folks gave it anywhere from 15 to 30 points. And then if you can see that there was actually a little more close ranking and weighting in the risk and uncertainty and the equity co-benefit lines. And then we included at the bottom here the 2 proposed additional criteria, but not everyone weighted those as they didn't know they were proposed. It was just one the individual who proposed each of those criteria were able to weight them if they wanted to, but no one else knew that those were in existence. So that's why there's not applicable for the rest of those commissioner boxes. So in terms of the conversation ahead of us in this meeting, we're trying to order things to provide a bit of an agenda for how to work through the issues that at least came up in the homework. And this is just an offer. The commission, if there are other pieces that the commission wants to move on first, this is the best we could come up with at the moment in looking through the homework. And so the thought was that could start the conversation with just trying to figure out whether there was interest in adding additional criteria to the straw proposal. And those 2 are listed here, the resilience idea and the avoided risks and associated costs. And the avoided risk and associated costs starts to get a little bit into the cost effectiveness criteria conversation because there's also some related proposed language. So our thought was to maybe move into talking about cost effectiveness from there. And there's also some overlap between cost effectiveness and risk and uncertainty, or at least questions about overlap. So folks were interested in getting some clarification on what those criteria meant and whether there was overlap, and then could work through specific definition changes for those particular criteria. And then the 3 co-benefit criteria are probably worth a lot of conversation based on the questions that came up. There was a number of questions about the overlap in relation to each other. And then as we walk through, there were a lot of proposed specific definition changes to work through there. And then of course, there are probably a lot more ideas that you all have for folks who haven't been able to weigh in, or having run through this explanation of the homework. responses that maybe it has prompted some more ideas. And so definitely want to leave room for that. And so after getting through all the criteria conversations, then we would hopefully turn to the weighting to be able to figure out, okay, now that folks are potentially feeling comfortable about the list of criteria and how they're defined, then the next step would be to talk about weighting. So that's what I've got, Chair McDonald, for this piece, and I'll turn it back to you.
I think you're on mute.
Apologies. We are running a little behind. Our intent had been to have some of the discussion, then take public comment, and then come back and make final decisions. And so I'm not sure, I'm feeling a little bit like maybe we open it up to public comment now, and then we try and have that conversation all at once, because I think it's going to be pretty hard for us to have some of it and then break and then come back. But any thoughts from other commissioners about the best path forward? Director Bateman.
I'm happy to take public comment now just for flow. I do have some ideas on the straw proposal, and I apologize. I was not one of the respondents and did not do my homework, but I do have some thoughts. So I'm happy to wait and offer those after the public gets a chance to comment.
Great, thank you. Other?
This is David Ford. Yeah, I agree. I think public comment's appropriate now, and then we can focus on the task at hand. So I think that would be appropriate.
Great.
This is Commissioner Jackson. I concur.
Thank you, Commissioner Jackson.
Commissioner Pardue concurs. And also, you know, when I saw this exercise, I really appreciated the straw man, but it also felt like it created a psychological anchor that was like, okay, this is kind of, you know, what it might look like. And then, you know, if you dare to disagree, you need to change the numbers, right? So I kind of think that, you know, the initial point of, you know, getting the public comment is a great next step. And then maybe we, after a thorough discussion, you know, we all can kind of weigh in. I didn't actually finish the exercise. I also got hung up on, well, when I do an ROI calculation, I'm looking at, you know, the benefit and the risk, you know, and the cost all at once. It's one equation, right? So I couldn't detach risk and uncertainty from the cost effectiveness, really. And so I felt weird about that, maybe. Anyway, but the discussion from the public and the comments from the public will inform all of us. And then maybe we all get a chance to reassess, starting with a clean slate.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you, Commissioner Pardue. With that, Linda, do we have folks that want to provide public comment?
Yes, we have Michelle DeWoller. Just a moment. Michelle,
Welcome,
you're
Michelle.
unmuted.
Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. It's Michelle Detweiler, but that's
Thank
okay.
you.
I get that a lot. And I'm the executive director of the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance. And as the poster child of nascent emerging technologies and solutions to address GHG emission reductions throughout various sectors, I can certainly understand the concern about cost effectiveness for some of the options that the commission is considering. And again, I put this in my comments, my written comments, but I do want to thank the commission for their consideration and their evaluation of the emerging renewable hydrogen, green hydrogen technologies that are out there. So, you know, these things will come down in cost with scale, with time, and with the federal legislation passed, particularly the production tax credit and investment tax credits for hydrogen passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. We are looking at having the time, you know, cutting in half the time it will take to get renewable hydrogen competitive with fossil fuel counterparts, and then speeding up the displacement of the use of those fossil fuels. So that's all I wanted to say, but thank you very, very much for all of your work and attention to this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for your comments. And I should have said, please, for those who are going to be making comments, if you could keep your comments to under 3 minutes, we'd appreciate that. Belinda, how many other folks do we have in the queue?
At this time, this is it. That was it.
Maybe give others a minute to raise their hand, just in case.
You know, Eric Strid, can I intervene
Yes.
and kind of speak on his behalf? He had a comment in the comments section that, you know, and again, and I'm speaking on his behalf because I'm representing the private sector here, and he's referring to his days in the tech industry here in Oregon. And, you know, the weighting exercise he's saying was frustrating, and it really, you know, the comment is that there was an apples versus oranges versus ham versus milk versus beer. And a different way to maybe say that, which kind of echoes what he says, is in each policy prescription, the weighting may be different for the co-benefits. I don't know how to express this, but like, and also it may be that really what we're looking for is a single equation that kind of looks at each one, and you know, one policy, for instance, might have a really great co-benefit over here that's really valuable, but we weighted it just 5% or 10% or didn't even put it on the list. And in the commercial real estate world, I earlier alluded to the commercial, you know, building owners want a 5 to 7 year payback for energy efficiency investments. That's been the rule of thumb for decades. But behind that, there's risk. But the other thing that will feed into the investment decisions the landlords will make might be tenant retention, which is if you make the space quieter and more comfortable, you can feed that into the equation. But ultimately, it's one equation. And so, you know, that's maybe representing what Eric Strid's concern was, but also kind of feeding in a little bit of my own perspective. So, Eric, I hope that was okay.
Thank
Hi,
you, Commissioner Pardue.
hi, Sam. That's good commentary. The quantifying things in
Would
one
you,
score has lots of problems. And
Eric, do you want to identify yourself?
oh, sorry, this is Eric Strid. I'm a retired high-tech CEO. Um, the trying to get everything into one-dimensional number is problematic in many ways, and to even define like the current bullets there, quantify those is problematic. So in the modeling, like what the EPS does is the Oregon Energy Policy Simulator is another simulator. It strictly says, okay, here's what the modeling does. Here's the equations. Here's the numbers. If you want to change this policy, it gives you how many different jobs is created. It gives you the difference in health benefits and so forth. So you can go in and just incrementally tweak each one and see what the different opportunities are. But that's a longer discussion. I don't know if I'm being useful here. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. I want to just recognize that Representative David Brock Smith has joined us today for our meeting. Thank you for joining us.
Chair McDonald, we have Kathy Moyd in the list.
Excellent. Kathy? Linda, is Kathy unmuted?
Okay,
Yes.
I apologize. I thought I had to click it too. This is Kathy Moyd. I follow all of these issues for the League of Women Voters, but I'm speaking here as an individual. I did notice under health risks, one of the things that's become obvious relatively recently is that use of some of the fossil fuels or some of the fuels for stoves causes a significant amount of toxic pollution even when the stove is off. This natural gas, and I would guess that the same thing is probably true of propane, but I'm not sure. And clearly in the low-income BIPOC communities, my guess is there are probably more children doing their homework on the kitchen table and therefore being exposed to it. So I'm not sure how you can specifically call attention to a specific fuels, but that's definitely something that affects their ability to do well in school, which is clearly going to affect their long-term potential incomes. So I'm not sure how you would include that, but it does seem to be something that we need to take into account.
Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate the comments. Anyone else in the queue?
No, not at this time.
Okay. Well, then I am going to recommend we do take our break now and give some thought to what we heard from the public and the discussion that we've had to date, and then come back and maybe step back just a minute to consider, or a few minutes to consider alternative approaches to doing this. And then if we want to stick with the approach that we've kind of adopted today, then we can more or less go down this order that that Zach has prepared for us. So with that, we'll take a 15-minute break, be back at 11:50. So it's a 14-minute break, and then and we'll reconvene. Thank you. I'd like to reconvene the Oregon Global Warming Commission meeting following our break. So if commissioners could come back. Just a little more time. Commissioners could reconvene and yeah, go on a video so that I know you're back. And if you need to go back off video, you can. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started and hope that some additional our commissioners get back soon. So we have a lot to think about based on what our previous discussion. I think we probably need a little more discussion and get a few more voices in the room about how to best proceed. I heard some concerns about what does it mean to rank things and what's the value of that. We talked a bit about a longer list of co-benefits, and there was a discussion of maybe we just identify must-haves and should-haves, and some of those might factor into the design of programs that we want to recommend, while others we might use to rank or evaluate the co-benefits. We also talked earlier about maybe just looking specifically at co-benefits in this analysis, or doing that in addition. So those are all the different things that I heard people talk through. I'm trying to be mindful of staff time and where we are in the process, but I also don't want to shortchange this co-benefits assessment. So I'd love to hear from some of the folks that haven't spoken yet today on maybe what your preference is for path moving forward, kind of staying the course, seeing what we get out of it, and then potentially doing some additional thinking around how we talk about co-benefits in the work that we're doing. But I'll open the floor and we'll spend a little bit of time just getting more thoughts, and then we'll come up with the path forward for the rest of our meeting. So if you raise your hand. I'll call on you. Director Bateman.
Thank you, Chair. I have a couple of ideas, really just in reaction to the straw proposal. And so I understand we may well go a completely different direction, but I don't mind using this as a framework and a direction of travel for where we're going. I think it just helps us prioritize and keep our thoughts organized. And I would note that we don't have to be terribly quantitative here. You know, this may be more of a kind of a squint and prioritize things in a more qualitative way. But I do think this type of an organization or table helps us organize our thoughts. I can send this to you as well if you would like my homework late. But I did mark up the document. You might find it to be helpful, and I just have half a dozen or so markups here. One was my thought, and that matches some other responses that you got in the assignment, to flip the weighting and really put the GHG emissions at the top. I think that we want to keep an eye on what we actually get for our efforts, and I would weight that more heavily than the cost effectiveness, which of course is very important, but I would flip those two numbers. And then I am a big fan of keeping evaluation criteria really as simple and few as possible, just so we can get our head wrapped around it. I would only, want a handful there. So I thought about taking out the risk and uncertainty, and it really feels to me like that's an additional column, not a row, and that it helps us ultimately get to the weighting. If we think about the likelihood of each of these things actually being effective, and the weight or the scope of their effectiveness. So we might want to either build it into each row or make it a column of its own, but I think it helps us get ultimately to the weighting. And it doesn't strike me, that row doesn't strike me as being like the others that really have substantive and technical outcomes associated with each. So I would take that out of the rows. For the health benefits, I appreciated the comments that were made by one of the other commissioners in terms of adding in something around asthma, and that naming that as health outcome that we'd want to keep an eye on. And under quality of life, I added a couple things like shade and safety. I don't know if those would be appropriate to add in there. And then lastly, under the economic piece, I added something around infrastructure failure, having to do with heat and fire events. And maybe we want to add something around, I don't know, crop loss or crops that were never planted, or something having to do with an eye on water and what it takes to bring a crop all the way through a season and to a successful conclusion. But those are just some of my thoughts. I appreciate the straw proposal, and as a way to provide a framework and organizing principle. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Holmes, or Banks, I'm sorry. I work with Rachel Holmes, so apologies.
No worries. Yeah, a couple of comments I neglected to say at the start. I'm the public health director for Oregon Health Authority. So I'm sure it'll be no surprise that I'm supportive of the health co-benefits, including the additional conditions that folks talked about. I think it is very important to name both the health outcomes, supportive of the quantity of life, quality of life, including some of the other comments, and then also an addition for really getting to decreasing the gaps in terms of health inequities. So, for example, I'm coming to this through the lens at Oregon Health Authority. Our overarching goal is to reduce health inequities by 2030, and being able to analyze both health benefits across the population, but also wanting to see those gaps reduced for populations who are experiencing inequities. I would also say in the equity co-benefit conversation, or just weighting that more heavily overall, because we're not starting at zero, and there's strategies that moving forward will achieve equity, but in order to do that, we have to redress and acknowledge that we're starting with past and historical inequities. And so in order to do that, you have to weight that heavier are focused on that population. In that, I think it's imperative that we do name those who have been historically marginalized or are have those inequities. And I think that's particularly important in a state like Oregon with both our demographics and geographic disbursement, because we could see benefits if we looked at it across the state or across populations that are actually making inequities worse for certain populations or certain parts of the state that would be masked if we just looked at equity overall without, once again, looking at those gaps. And then I think that there's a way to, one of the ways to increase the weight on equity is to actually increase it in terms of points. But I also think another way is to incorporate other equity considerations in the other areas. So, you know, much to discussion of who's benefiting, who's burdening, and being really specific. For example, like I mentioned in the health co-benefit, if we added the addition of reducing inequities or closing those gaps, that's another way to weight more heavily towards equity, acknowledging that, you know, once again, we're not starting in a level playing field, even if we designed or chose the best, most equitable strategies moving forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Banks. Other comments commissioners would like to share? And this is, you know, kind of stepping back a little bit, and then we can. Kelly Dundon.
Thank you. I just wanted to highlight, it looks like you received multiple comments on adding resiliency, and we just think that's important either as a standalone category or incorporating it into some of the other categories, because there's obviously savings if you have a better building envelope for extreme weather conditions or dual fuel systems or things like that. There is varying levels of resiliency across some of these actions. So we think it is important to include in this assessment as a co-benefit.
Thank you. Well, it appears that there are people that would want to go ahead and kind of take the task as it was described to us. We can always come back to this or you know, look at it in a different way, maybe evaluating and making sure we're not losing the detail to get at some of the comments about, you know, the challenge of washing something out because it's just in the mix someplace. And then I think we also can talk about design elements and some of the things that will be critical to design elements as a separate part of our report. But unless there are objections or a different path forward that somebody wants to put on the table, I recommend we go ahead with the task as outlined and then think about how to, you know, what, if anything else, we might want to think about relative to this task. Commissioner Pardue, you had do you have a different path forward you could propose? Okay.
No, I think this is probably I couldn't think of a better way, so.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, then why don't we go back to having Zach share his screen, and we'll take the issues in the order he proposed. And we can, you know, reflect on some of the comments we just made that were just made in terms of talking about the different pieces. So we had two recommendations for additions, but I wanted to give space for anyone else to, if there were other additions that people want to put on the table, now would be the time.
Well, the one I suggested in chat was policy resilience. And it's kind of similar to community resilience, but really what it speaks to is that ultimately these policies are political, you know, results, right? You know, what we're trying to do here is create an equation that will maximize public good, but it also has to last over many years. And right now in New York City, Local Law 97 is designed to promote huge investments in energy efficiency, but the commercial real estate market there is in a deep recession, so it's undermining support for the law. And that's just something I don't know exactly how to measure it, but I think it may speak to, you know, policies where people opt in or incentivized might have greater durability than policies that are mandated. But you know, that's just a discussion point.
Thank you, Commissioner Pardue. When I saw that comment in the chat, it made me think that that could potentially be part of risk and uncertainty. And also, to your point, might be more something we should highlight in terms of how different policies and programs get designed, rather than necessarily in you know, an evaluation criteria here, but could be part of risk and uncertainty.
That's fine. You know, I think that's a good way to think about it. That might be a good way to fold it in. So
Okay.
thank you,
Commissioner. Thank you.
Yeah, if you look at the
McDonald.
way the definition is written in the straw proposal, how likely is the cost effectiveness and greenhouse gas reductions from the action likely to actually materialize? The policy variations or aspects of that could easily fit within that, and you could call that out, for instance.
Exactly. Yep. Commissioner Apter?
Yeah, thank you. I guess first, just to respond to that, I had the same thought that it could fit under that category. I do feel like it is much more subjective than a lot of the other considerations here. So I just would want to be clear in terms of how we're defining political or, you know, that kind of policy longevity question. So maybe something we can turn back to. Just seems a little bit difficult to kind of fit in or quantify in the same way some of these other considerations might be. I was just going to weigh in as far as potential other additions. I heard Director Bateman and I think others speak to what seems like avoided costs from avoided climate impacts. So I think I agree with Director Bateman around you know, the economic piece. If we're able to quantify things like failing infrastructure related to climate-fueled heat and wildfire events, certainly there are economic impacts to consider in terms of effects on our natural resource economy. I think some of those might already be considered in health benefits and avoided costs, but my understanding was most of those were related to avoided costs resulting from reduced fossil fuels and related co-pollutants. So just seems like there's an interest in considering how to incorporate cost benefits from avoided climate impacts, if I'm understanding what Commissioner Bateman and others have shared.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these things are designed to move us faster, farther, faster. And so they will all have, you know, and we saw in the economic analysis that was done earlier that we talked about at our last meeting, you know, the real benefits of accelerating our action across the board. And so I'm trying to get my head around how you would apply that thinking to an individual action. I don't know, Director Bateman, do you have any follow-on thoughts?
Not on that point. I'm not coming up with anything creative at the moment, but I did want to circle back just for a moment and echo Commissioner Apter's comments on the policy and political piece being somewhat subjective. And it occurred to me that it's important to know that, you know, some of those challenges might be there and it might actually affect how we go about designing implementation ultimately, because if you want to shore up support, it will affect who you're talking to, your outreach, you know, your whole messaging strategy and engagement strategy. And so it kind of takes and almost takes us to the next level. If we have an eye on that, it may not help us decide whether we're going to pursue one of these or not, but it sure would help us figure out how to implement and make it successful.
Absolutely. That was my thought. It seems like it's a how to execute idea.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone want to speak to the? I'll just say I put resilience on the list. What I was thinking about in particular when I added it to the list was, actions like distributed or rooftop solar and community-based renewable energy programs kind of help us with resilience in the energy system. So those were the things that were in my mind as I was putting it down. Alan made the point that maybe all of them would weigh roughly the same along those lines. I'm still somewhat interested in seeing the results of that. I tried to look at the list and see, what kind of difference it would make, but and perhaps it's not a meaningful addition, but that was my thinking behind adding resilience in. I do know that a number of people raised concerns about diluting the overall list if we add too many. So I do appreciate that. That was my rationale.
Yeah, if I might add in here, evaluation criteria, again, it's not whether or not it's an important climate change issue, it's whether or not it will help us distinguish the group of actions. So if, for instance, a evaluation criteria, if they all ended up with 10, that didn't help distinguish. But it did do what Commissioner McDonald said, which is it diluted the rest of the things, but proportionally, so it didn't make it. So I'm curious if people think that, for instance, on resilience, whether or not that would actually be distinguishing among the list of actions that are in the scenarios.
I don't know whether we need to go back to the list. Kelly?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was just looking at the marginal abatement costs with the list of all the actions, and I think there is some ability to differentiate looking at those. Like you said, a lot might meet some of the resiliency criteria, but there's going to be some that maybe don't, or there's maybe the opportunity to incorporate resilience as part of the definition under the costs or the jobs and employment and under the health benefits, because there's definitely elements of resiliency that lead to health benefits. So even if it's not a separate category, I think it's important to have it in this discussion, and it might be, if it's not a separate category, might be able to be incorporated into the definitions of some of these other categories.
Commissioner McNamara?
Yeah, I actually think that approach makes some sense. I'd note also that resilience can factor into quality of life and certainly into equity from the perspective of community stability. A community that's completely displaced by wildfire is a community that could be more resilient if the right actions were taken. And agree that those actions aren't necessarily on this list here, but that factor of how people respond or impacted by climate events is one of both quality of life and also equity. The reason I raised my hand originally, though, was to just ask what kind of process aside from this body has gone into determining this set of factors, because I do worry a little bit about a small group of people who have a pretty reasonable amount of power in the state with regard to these issues, and the folks who have the capacity and just know that the commission exists to track it. I'm worried that we're missing a perspective from the communities that we're hoping will benefit from these potential actions, and that kind of like on the ground perspective of what to weigh. I feel a little uncomfortable making kind of thumbs up, thumbs down, or weighting things differently without getting that kind of community impact. I imagine there aren't resources or time for that, but did just want to ask whether there's anything we can do to really hear from other Oregonians and Oregonians who aren't as engaged in this space, how they would want us to weight this because this is going to have really big impacts potentially on people's lives if this drives policy directions. And I would not want it to happen in the kind of vacuum that we're in. And that like the seed for this work starts with what the people who are going to be impacted and their needs and values, especially as we're talking about co-benefits.
Thank you, Commissioner Magnera. We did have early on in the process some opportunities for public engagement. Will acknowledge that, not probably as far and wide as I think you are hoping for. It was, again, people who are kind of already tracking the commission, I think, that primarily participated. I don't think I don't know that we have time to do that kind of an analysis now, or that kind of outreach, I should say, now. One thought is that some of what we might hear from folks might have more to do with how to design a policy rather than, what the policy options are. So I think that we should build something into our work moving forward that really digs into talking very explicitly about the how and the importance of designing programs so that, as we were discussing earlier, so that we're not only trying to equalize, but really recognize where we're starting from in terms of needing to address equity issues in different areas of the state. Commissioner Sheeran?
Yes, thank you. Perhaps alongside the spirit that Commissioner Magnera just mentioned about making sure that we bring as much diverse input into the creation of these, indicators as we can, I would just remind folks that there's actually a very similar conversation happening right now over at the Oregon Public Utilities Commission in the context of establishing guidelines and rules for how utilities will draft their clean energy plans to demonstrate compliance with HB 2021. And so there's a sort of a robust conversation that's happening in those workshops about what are the appropriate sort of community benefit indicators that utilities should use to evaluate the different resource choices that they might make to comply with the law, as well as, what are the resiliency features, of those different resources. And so I would encourage us as we're contemplating this to try, particularly for something like resiliency, which is so critically important, and yet depending upon who you talk to, you might get a very, very different answer about what resiliency means. That, within the context of state government, we try to, come up with as, close and cohesive sort of an understanding or definition of resiliency, and that we are, applying that as consistently as we can, in these different arenas where we're talking about sort of, different levers or, different approaches to achieving the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals.
That's a really good point. Where in the process is the PUD's discussion, and do you know when it'll be kind of a first iteration will be wrapped up?
The commissioners had a public hearing yesterday where they deliberated staff's proposals for guidelines for how to include community benefit indicators, in the clean energy plan going forward. So, and this will continue to be discussed, over the next, few weeks or month. There was also a third party study, I guess would be the right word to use, that the commission did, looking at resiliency and how resiliency might be measured in the context of these clean energy plans that might be useful as well.
Great, that sounds like a great resource. And I completely agree that we should try and be as consistent as we can be across the different bodies of the state that are thinking about this work. Just looking to see if people have other comments. So, and Kristen, your hand is still up, or did you have another comment?
Apologies.
No worries. So let me see if I can summarize where we are on resiliency. Heard comments about it being important, especially as we think about design and implementation of programs. I heard that there is an ongoing conversation, maybe two conversations. Commissioner Magniera mentioned that there's also the environmental justice mapping that DEQ and OHA is doing, which could be a future tool for us to use. So I think we should make a decision about whether or not to add resilience to our list now or not. I'm gonna sidebar that, and then because I don't think we're going to be able to have a vote on each decision. That I think would take too long, but maybe we can try and get a couple of the things and then maybe bundle them together and see if we can vote on a couple things at a time. So would the person that proposed the avoided risks and associated cost co-benefits want to speak to that? And I think it was when staff and I looked at this, it looked like it was identified as a standalone, but some of the language was also tucked into the cost effectiveness. So maybe speak to whether or not you think it should be on its own or could be part of the cost effectiveness consideration.
Thanks, Chair McDonald. I'm happy to speak to that. So again, and hopefully this is relatively clear, but the goal with adding this criteria to the analysis is really just considering, uncertainty around securing affordable RNG, and just recognizing the fact that, purchasing RNG and investing in infrastructure to produce RNG is expensive. And so how can we make sure that this analysis is considering that investments in alternative fuels like RNG are inherently, risky for Oregon customers and our climate, and also trying to ensure that that consideration acknowledges that those risks will especially impact, renters and low-income households who are already disproportionately burdened by high energy costs. So I added this both to avoided cost and as a standalone. It does to me feel somewhat separate from the cost effectiveness consideration. Of course, it is relevant to that, but also considering that we're thinking about, energy burden and future cost impacts related to stranded infrastructure and investments, it just felt it could also be added as a separate category. That being said, I have heard some commissioners raise the desire to try to, keep our scope of co-benefits and other analysis points more narrow, or at least not expand much beyond what we currently have. So I think this could also, as I said, fit under the cost assessment and is, relevant to, I think, other areas as well. So maybe similar to resilience, there's other places it could fit.
Yeah, another thought is maybe in the risk and uncertainty, something that could potentially be included in that. Kelly.
Yeah, just to respond to that, I think part of Nora's concerns about the availability of RNG was kind of addressed in some of the other modeling that SSG did and talked about in previous meetings about taking a conservative approach to the quantities available. So I'm not sure if that is, I feel like that's already sort of addressed in just the overall actions that were modeled, but just thought I would remind everyone that that conservative approach was taken in the modeling. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Just to clarify, I think what I'm talking about is more so costs of the infrastructure and expanded investments, particularly as we're pursuing electrification and other policies. So just considering, rising infrastructure costs and spending, potentially millions of dollars as the gas system retracts, and considering how those investments will affect particularly low-income ratepayers and others who will be, continuing to face costs related to risks of stranded assets. So I think it is separate from the previous conversations around assumptions in the SSG modeling.
And I'll just add, I guess, that's getting into a little bit more of the upstream development. And I was under the impression a lot of this analysis isn't really considering like the cost of increased renewable electricity generation. That would sort of fall into similar buckets of infrastructure spending. And so I'm not sure if we're going to consider that for one side, it also probably some of the risk of permitting transmission lines and other things like that. That seemed outside the scope of a lot of this assessment because it was more of the upstream generation type pieces. But yeah.
Yeah, I think the difference I'm seeing here is the impact on ratepayers, which is potentially easier to quantify in this case, but recognize, if we're considering infrastructure investments, we can talk about that more broadly as well.
So that also tuck into the economic prosperity criteria that we have. I'm thinking this is a really difficult task for us to finish. We've got about an hour left. I would maybe welcome Alan and Zach if you have revised thoughts on what's most important for us to do. It feels like the hardest thing for us to do is going to be to define each of these.
Yeah, this is I've done this about a dozen times. This is inherently a very difficult task, and it does take some time. But there's a increasing synergy that happens with continued discussion, so that it hopefully kind of funnels us down into a more agreement. And so maybe a little bit more discussion, but then if anybody has any specific proposals about how to adjust the straw proposal, might be after a bit more discussion, specific proposals about adjustments, deletions, additions to the straw proposal would be an appropriate way to go, Chair.
Thank you.
And Chair McDonald, I also have a Word document that I'm happy to share with the straw proposal. And if we get to that point of doing track changes in there, I can capture folks' thoughts if that would be helpful.
Great, thank you, Zach. So it heard some sense that we put resilience in, but maybe it's feathered into all of these, and maybe the same thing with the cost considerations that Commissioner Apter was just discussing on cost effectiveness. We are trying to remember the reflection, Alan, that you and Zach had on the second bullet on this definition, and whether we could really get our arms around that. And I realize I'm jumping around now, so apologies for that.
Yeah, I tried to address this earlier, but we don't know exactly. So all along the way, we've been talking about what to include and kind of staying away from how to do the program once it gets included. And exactly how much incentives a heat pump gets or some other solar project or something like that gets is kind of hard to define until it's actually done. And so that makes it a difficult thing to incorporate. But also that total cost uh, concept, that if the state gives an incentive or utility gives incentives, it's still cost in Oregon, regardless of who ends up paying it. So this has been a total cost model. We didn't have the capability to turn on a dime and incorporate the IRA tax credits, which are still a little bit, or incentives that are still a little bit ill-defined. So I was suggesting that that might be something that we will know more about by the next time we do this, and it would be a very more detailed analysis we could do for the next round of this, because it's still only what, less than 3 weeks old.
Okay, do we want to, why don't we go through and discuss the rest of the definitions? And then we can maybe come back to the top and consider additions and kind of try and get some consensus on the definitions. So risk and uncertainty. One of the ideas that we put in here was to also kind of include the resilience of policy as one consideration of risk and uncertainty. Any comments on the risk and uncertainty? Proposed revision?
Yes, this is Brenda Bateman. I would put the policy consideration here. I like that. I think they fit well together. And I do like the underlined piece, because I think what that means is when we're talking about risk, we're taking into account both the likelihood and the what's the word I'm looking for? The scope, the volume or the force, but also, right? How strong it is, not just whether it's likely or not. So having both of those pieces in there, I think, is really important.
Great, thank you.
As a scorer, how would you distinguish the underlying portion from greenhouse gas emission reductions? What's the difference? Like, clarify that, please.
Let's see. Well, I think the volume, what's the word I'm looking here for, the size of the risk isn't necessarily pointed at GHG emissions. It's just the likelihood, and then is it a strong likelihood or a weak likelihood? I think is what that's measuring, not necessarily the GHG outcomes themselves, but the risk.
The amount is covered in the GHG reductions criteria, but this is about this, you know, how likely are they to materialize? Both the amount of reductions and the cost can be very encompassing, including policy, including other things,
Well,
depending on how you want to define it.
And I'm thinking about risk, like when we do, you know, when our internal auditors look at like financial risk, they always talk about it not just in terms of likelihood, but also the frequency and how soon it will happen, and the scope of you know, whether it's strong or weak. And so it's really all pointed at measuring the risk, not the tangible or issue outcomes themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And in this case, when we score it, we're gonna kind of put maybe 5 groupings, you know, high, medium, low, low, and then put based on our professional judgment, where did each of these actions fit on that scale? Related to the risk and uncertainty that it won't be this cost effective, that it'll actually be more expensive, or that the reductions aren't really going to materialize because they just can't get there. You know, like for instance, both the 70% electrification and 70% hydrogen industrial both of those I think have really high uncertainty and risk associated with them because they're very difficult to do. Might be an example.
Yeah, for me, if I may, Chair, yeah, I kind of view the realized emission savings as talking to is we've already kind of covered that, I think, and if it's an issue of timing, it's whether they actually will materialize, and in the time frame. You know, is it the front end of the time frame, the back end of the time frame? Timing may be more important than the emissions savings measure because we're going to measure that in the greenhouse gas piece of this evaluation is what I'm hearing you say, Alan, if I'm hearing it correctly.
Exactly. All of these are, at least almost all of them have emissions that occur over that time period through 2035. They don't have some that just occur in 2025 and some that just occur in 2034. They actually, most of them occur over time, which is why you don't want to start with one and don't do that one and don't do the next one until you start to complete that one. You have to do kind of all of them together. So there is this time element to it that it has to occur over time too. And then some of the things like RNG and hydrogen in particular don't show up in big quantities with regard to RNG until later in that time period, the 2030 to 35. And if you notice on the both the electrification and hydrogen for industry, that time frame shifted to 2050 because they're later in the, so there is a time element to it.
So Alan, you're telling us that you see the added text as being redundant with the greenhouse gas measure that we've already got included. Is that right?
Yeah, I was trying to see if someone could distinguish that. I didn't really hear that.
Okay. Any other comments or questions around risk and uncertainty?
This is Commissioner Reitman. I feel like it is built into this exercise. It is a roadmap. Certainly there'll be a lot of changes as time goes on. But I would honor the 12 revisions that have already been made by Alan and say that we go ahead with it as presented.
You know, I think the policy risk is broadly folded into this current definition of risk. You know, and I guess maybe it's just helpful to know how the assessment of risk is, you know, what are the variables feeding into risk, and maybe there's just kind of an enumeration of what, you know, how those risks are. You know, there's technology risk, there's financing risk, policy risk is one of them. You know, there's economic risks, I suppose, all kinds of risks, but maybe it's just helpful to surface that.
Yeah, good point. Commissioner Reitman, I heard you put a proposal on the table to honor the original straw proposal. I think we should have a little more discussion about a couple of the other definitions and then maybe come back to your proposal and see if the commission wants to vote on that.
Sure.
To more specific, Commissioner Perdue's comment that we could actually list them here as sub bullets: technology risk, policy risk, programmatic risk, resource availability risk, and spend a lot of time figuring that out right now. We could also, in the final or in the report that we bring back to you, because you're going to see this and then look at it and comment on it, that we could enumerate that a little bit more and bring that back as sub bullets for you, or at least in text.
This is Commissioner Ford. I think, Alan, your suggestion about bringing it back to us in a written form that's articulated, I think seems like the right timing from my perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's look at a couple of the other definitions, just have enough discussion, and then, you know, to Commissioner Ford's point, maybe we instruct staff to go back and try and take this discussion, this very rich discussion that we've had and come up with a 2.0 version of this. So, but I think a little more conversation around a couple of the other criteria would be good, or co-benefits would be good. So Zach, next slide, maybe.
Yeah, I'll move to the next slide. I just wanted to also raise before we leave this one that earlier in the discussion this morning, folks are wondering whether risk and uncertainty also applied to the co-benefits. So just as a placeholder for further conversation.
Good point.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, Commissioner Ford, no, thank you for raising it again. So I guess the question is, it doesn't apply now, but if it doesn't apply now, I certainly think it should apply to those to those co-benefits as well. Was my perspective from this morning's earlier discussion.
Great.
Yeah, certainly can be taken into consideration in the assessment of this. This one more than most of, well, I shouldn't say that. They're all going to have a bit of judgment associated with them because you're trying to quantify the qualitative, which is always fraught with issues. But the more we explain it in the proposal that we bring back for review by the commission, we got that message. So we'll try endeavor to do that.
Great. Thank you. Okay, let's move to the next one. I think the big question that staff raised on some of the changes that were proposed was where we might be able to get some of some information. The proposal was to use the EPA COBRA analysis to help us evaluate this, which, as I understand it, only addresses outdoor air pollutants. So I guess one question is whether people have information on sources of information that we could use to get at the indoor as well as the outdoor. And then maybe some of the specifics on the additions of illnesses, which I may or may not be included in the EPA COBRA. Gabriella, is that something you can speak to?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Gabriella Goldfarb, I'm the Environmental Public Health Section Manager at the Oregon Health Authority, and unfortunately, Rachel Banks, Director Banks, had to leave. I'll speak to that point, and she and I were able to have kind of side chats throughout, so I have a few points that we were waiting for this part of the conversation to raise. The SSG team met with our environmental epidemiology team and early on, and I think a revisit would be helpful. Also our toxicology team, part of what, if it's going to be judgment and qualitative in a way, part of what an analysis that OHA could think about doing, or partnering maybe with academic partners, figuring out how to do this, is looking at either proxies for indoor air health outcome impacts, but also looking at what the research literature says. So I think offline I can consult with some of my team and figure out what would be the best way to get at this. So happy to try to do that. And then,
thank you.
If there's others who want to speak to that, I'll hold off on the other OHA comments.
Is that like a 4-hour meeting, Gabriella?
No, very concise.
Anyone else want to speak to sources of information or approach to the inclusion of indoor as well as outdoor considerations?
Thanks, Chair McDonald. This is Commissioner Apter. There are a plethora of studies that I think the Commission could consider in quantifying and considering impacts to health from indoor air pollutants. I'm happy to share a list with Alan or both of you.
Thank you, Commissioner Apter. And then the second proposed change would would someone like to speak to how they were thinking about that change and whether it's consistent with or different than some of the changes we just discussed?
I can speak to that a little bit. Are we talking about the bottom box suggestions?
Yes.
Okay. I think that was just an attempt to really simplify, not take away, but simplify the definition, and then also really bring quality of life highlighted a little more than it maybe previously was, and add to that definition. So some of the things other people have mentioned about renter retention because of comfort and things like that. That was just an attempt to incorporate, I think, a few more of those things, and in making quality of life and health a little more simplified and highlighted equally.
Thank you, Kelly. Other comments on the health co-benefit? Kelly, the only part of the second bullet that didn't seem to fit for me was the preserving energy choice for customers. That I guess that's a quality of life option, but it feels a little bit outside of that kind of concept of the increased comfort and.
Yeah, I think that just goes to consumer choice and all of the studies that have been done around home buyership and what the preferred. So that was just kind of a quality of life piece underlying that choice.
Gabriella?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to step back on this and express some discomfort about the degree of specificity here with some of this. The COBRA analysis is an important building block for this because it's well accepted and broadly captures important information. But I guess I want to return to the comments that Director Banks made that how do we focus the weighting on, so co-benefits accrue to those who are disproportionately burdened by climate risk, who have fewer buffers against climate impacts. And with every piece that's added, it might, well, first of all, this as written, this isn't focusing on benefits for whom. And I think that's the overarching idea, that we'd want to relook at the health, the jobs, the equity, the equity benefit asks that explicitly, but in these other ones, if you are not looking at benefits for whom, then it is going to dilute the equity benefits and outcomes. Another point is just recognizing the broader policy context and what may already be happening and prioritized. We've already seen the legislature prioritize actions to help people in real time right now, protect themselves from excessive heat and smoke, or temperature extremes and smoke. And so how does that affect the kind of the considerations here? Maybe that gets, I don't know if that's incorporated in risk or whatever, but there's kind of this is a policy choice, and that's a clear policy choice that we're already seeing the legislature make. So how does that inform, do you go against the tide with something else, or do you kind of recognize that these are going to be, it may increase the feasibility or reduce the risk or whatever to make those kinds of choices? And just adding to that conversation about the point that Commissioner Maniera led about hearing from community and the opportunities that Commissioner Sharon talked about with looking at what the PUC is already doing. I'll add for OHA, every 5 years we put together a state health improvement plan. And it's not a plan for OHA, it's a plan for everybody. But OHA's most recent plan was done very differently than our past plans, by contracting with community-based organizations across the state to ask community what were the barriers to health. And one of the clear priorities that came out were economic drivers of health related to transportation, housing, energy burdens. So we have some, some information collected from community that I think we can point to. And I think there's so many agencies now that have recently gone through much more equity-focused conversations with community, bringing in voices that traditionally haven't been brought in. So it's a burden on the ODO staff, but maybe there is a way to review recent in the past 2, 3 years efforts to hear from community and try and help that inform things here. And finally, concerned about making a decision on these bullets, sub-bullets today, without kind of hearing back from SSG about what is feasible to measure. That gets to the offer from OHA to try and help with, what additional data could we get from that. But I think community voice and technical feasibility and this idea of having so much that it ends up diluting a focus on benefits for whom I think are the kind of 4 points that we wanted to make when we got to this, health/job/equity conversation.
Thank you. So I'm hearing that you would advise that we stick with the COBRA analysis. Is that one of the, am I hearing you right on that?
Yeah, it's the, not having the perfect be the enemy of the good, and figuring out what other few things would be good to look at. I guess part of the question here is to, to see if there's agreement on that question of, for the co-benefits, do we prioritize benefits for whom? That's kind of the overarching question.
Yeah, that was the next topic I was going to bring up, because I think it does fall into all of the next co-benefits that we're talking about. And when I thought about it, I thought that would come out more in the design of programs and policies rather than the actual, but there may be, to the point that Commissioner Pardue made early in the meeting, where if you were looking at the MAC curve and you were thinking about the co-benefits of quality of life, and that there might be a complete reverse of thinking about new buildings versus existing stock, where you might have more people might be in existing stock that could benefit from improved quality of life and health conditions from energy efficiency like actions. So I struggled a little bit with whether or not we could really get into the how discussion at this point, or if that's kind of the next thing that we try and tackle, is synthesizing all of the good information that you're referencing and others have too, and create some kind of a policy document on how we should be defining our energy policies going forward. Alan, do you want to jump in, and then Suzanne, I'll go to you.
Oh, sure. I did want to comment a little bit on the SSG work, which has been fantastic and really well done. And they have provided us with the metrics that comes out of their model already. And that was part of their scope of work. Not part of their scope of work was to get into the co-benefits and try to go do this part of the analysis. So their work for us is in the contract is done. We can still ask them questions and stuff, but they did provide us with that. If Zach, you go back to that list of initial co-benefits, there are a lot of things that they provided to us about in terms of metrics that we use, that we intend to use, more towards the bottom, energy use and building and transportation costs, but all and some of those things, and the health benefits they did, and the job benefits in particular, the ones they were able to quantify. But we're unfortunately, we get the $1 million grant. We only got the $250,000 grant to help with the analysis.
Got it.
But having all said that, one of the things that we've done in the past is some people were very efficient in this process, and they said, okay, it's 75% COBRA, 25% quality of life or 15% or things like that. So, that kind of conversation as we move forward, especially on the equity and jobs one, would be somewhat helpful. Like, where do things lie in terms of what should be the primary or definitional bullet that we look at when we do this scoring?
Suzanne?
Thank you. I have a few different thoughts. I'll try to keep my thoughts organized. Partly Gabriella already talked about some of the things I was going to mention. I think specific to health, I think we're maybe creating too big of a bread basket to start bringing in a lot of quality of life factors, harder to measure. I think it narrows it per sector. I think those are really pretty building specific items. And I think there's just a lot of potential co-benefits, and at some point we have to just sort of prioritize them a little bit. That's not a comment specific to anything, but just in the overall conversation, there's probably a few things that are going to fall off a little bit just because that's going to be the nature of it. I'll put out something else, and this isn't really an ODOT comment, but just for consideration of the group. We're talking a lot about co-benefits, I think, for whom is part of it, and I think there's a way to, I would like to embed equity more into the health and the jobs and the prosperity components. But I also raised the issue of other species in the natural environment. I think one way to approach that is to weight the greenhouse gas measures higher, knowing that that impacts everybody and everything, and every co-benefit, almost, not every, but many of them will gain by reducing the impact of greenhouse gas emissions, right? But for consideration, is it only sort of a human value that will increase the weighting on a factor? Or are there other things to consider? Some people have brought up food crops and so forth, right? Like, if we devalue the natural benefits, some of those are going to come right back into our quality of life considerations. So raising that, and I think that might have been the bulk of what I wanted to say, but I think my thoughts kind of go across health, jobs, prosperity, and then equity, and then sort of maybe simplifying and narrowing a bit so that we're really making that differentiation. I know it's important, and we all hold a lot of these values really deeply. So maybe there's a way to narratively capture them, but the data really points at the things that most correlate to. I don't know, maybe that's not the right way to think of it, but most also support a good greenhouse gas measure. And then just saying amongst those, it flips it a little bit, right? I don't know if we can grab every possible benefit. So I think that captures where I was going with that.
Great, thank you. We should probably move along and talk about the last couple, and then I think I want to revisit the question about what do we do next and how do we do it. So, Zach, do you want to kind of remind us of the kind of big decisions we need to make on the jobs and prosperity?
Sure. Yeah. Let me get my video on here. Well, for some reason, the video is not working. I apologize. But
we can see you now.
Okay, great. I think, so one of the big things was the overall naming of this particular co-benefit and what it considered. So there was a suggestion to maybe just refer to it as economic prosperity co-benefit and take out the number of cumulative job years created. And so I guess that might be one point of discussion. And then there's a couple of new concepts that have been offered. One on fossil fuel price volatility, increased energy efficiency, and the amount of downtime / lost days. So those might be some of the things to talk about.
And we do, as Alan mentioned, we do have a jobs assessment from SSG, and there were, as I recall, and maybe Alan, you can remind me, there were some losses, but overall big gains at the scenario level on jobs.
Right,
Is
and
that-
most of those losses associated with in the automotive industry because there's a lot less maintenance required for EVs, but big job gains and of course, if you remember the graph, it went up in the short term and then kind of declined over time as the programs kind of were administered over time through 2035. So it has a peak and then a decline, but overall there was like 65,000 job years created in the peak year from the cumulative of all of them. But that cumulative number was built by adding up all of the ones for each action. And also SSG was able to do that using modeling that they've used in the past, and that's common and widely accepted. As well, that other bullet, the decrease in household or business transportation costs, they were able to identify those and give us metrics on that, as well as the decrease in household or business building energy costs, where they were able to quantify those as well.
Great, thank you for that reminder. That was part of why I wasn't sure that we needed to spend a lot of time talking about jobs in this co-benefits analysis. It's certainly important, but I was thinking we could maybe focus in on the economic prosperity here rather than on both. Any concerns about that approach? And we've got Gabriella.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's going to be a repeating theme, but for whom, which jobs is it? The information that you got from SSG able to disaggregate to, I don't know what the metric is of, income quartiles or whatever. If it's all white collar jobs that are created, then, what does that mean in a world where you're prioritizing, you're wanting to send price signals that make fossil fuels more expensive, and it's not being compensated for in other benefits that decrease costs and increase life expectancy. I want to also elevate something that Commissioner Maniera pointed out, which is the state, and that maybe it's possible to defer some of this and point to in the future, the state is going to be developing the environmental justice mapping tool that, hopefully will be not only focused on, where pollution burdens are, but also where opportunities are with interventions that, some other tools do things like maximizes life expectancy, for example, if you invest in this kind of thing in parks or whatever it is. So again, I guess all of this can be revised with more information and more time and perhaps more resources to do further deeper dive analysis. So I'm interested to hear what the trade-off is between being very specific at this point with definitions versus, kind of broad policy, categories. And I know you have to make decisions, but to distinguish different elements, but it would be challenging to have these decisions be communicated with a high degree of specificity and confidence if we're not so confident in what the outcomes are.
Yeah, to answer that question, the jobs numbers were sector-based, as is the whole model. So they're getting to who gets the job more related to how the programs are designed. Some are going to be market-based job gains and job losses that we don't get to design into the measure, but some are programmatic decisions about who would we hire and how those programs get administered. But again, that's more in the how as opposed to the what category, which we're trying to figure out the what here.
Commissioner Pardue.
Just wondering if there's a way to measure the impact of, my understanding is we send $8 billion a year out of our state every year just for transportation fuels, right? And what is the economic impact when that money stays inside of our state in the terms of we're investing in renewable energy production, wind and solar in our own state to power an electrification of our fleet. It seems like there's a lot more kind of, there'd be more capital, there'd be more tax revenue, there'd be more income, but from that phenomenon, but I don't know how to enumerate that.
We did get an analysis from SSG of some of that benefit. So I think that's captured in the work that we got from SSG. Alan, is that correct?
Yeah, so both in those two second and third bullets there, the decrease in energy costs that get to be spent in a different way. And my experience is most every other way besides electricity or natural gas has a higher multiplier in the economy. So if you save on energy, that's a benefit to the economy. We're not going to be able to capture that. And the same with the $8 billion a year that we send out of the state for transportation fuels in particular, is captured in that, partially captured in that transportation cost metric. So we have reductions in that gets multiplied into the economy as well and a higher multiplier, but we're not capturing that last part directly in this analysis.
I'm going to jump in without raising my hand, but I think there's some complexity here around if the consumer saves cost, that cost probably went to pay someone for a job, and then was the job local or not local? I just think this is complex interplay here, and some of the transportation strategies and energy consumption strategies will raise cost. So then you want to bring equity in, but you may not want to disfavor it just because there was a cost shift. So I just want us to have some deep thinking here to the extent that we put a high priority in this area, just because it's complicated where there's gains, where there's losses, who saves, who benefits, who's building something, and then the ratepayers paid for it, et cetera. It sort of plays out extensively.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the energy costs and transportation costs are directly related fuel. If you shifted from an ICE vehicle going to electricity, you used less energy, but it was cheaper. And so you have this savings associated with that. Same with energy costs. If you have an energy efficiency measure like a heat pump or other things, or renewables like putting rooftop solar, you reduced your electricity costs. And that's the cost that was captured in these two metrics, just that direct cost.
Any other discussion of the jobs and economic prosperity co-benefit? Sam, you still have or Commissioner Pardue, you still have your hand up. Did you have another comment? No. Okay.
No, maybe just to echo that this idea that for whom the benefits register is really important, because $50 a month saved on energy bills for one household is nothing, but for another household it's very important. Yeah, that's it.
Absolutely. Well, we have probably a little over 30 minutes left. We want to cover what's next, and we want to make sure we're giving good direction to staff for hopefully how they can synthesize all of this rich discussion that we've had with an updated proposal. So I'm going to suggest we go to the last one, and then we kind of revisit what we want staff to do next.
I think Chair McDonald, maybe two pieces of discussion here. One is, as you can see in that bottom box, there was a suggestion of potentially taking out that first bullet on underserved populations. And so might be a good place for discussion, because also there was a commissioner who suggested further defining underserved communities, including rural and frontier parts of Oregon. And then maybe the other piece is just discussing that additional bullet that's been offered in the first box around expanded gas infrastructure and the like.
Yeah, and I can speak to the eliminating the first bullet in the second box. To me, that was more of a how. And so I wasn't quite sure how we would figure that out. at the action level, but really more be something we want to focus on doing implementation as we kind of talk back and forth about. So that was my thought, not really important, but that it maybe comes in when we start talking about the how. And I mean, Gabriella, you've made this point about the last two discussions. Do you see a way to kind of do this at the action level? Or what? Because I can't quite think through how we would do that.
Yeah. I mean, one, in talking with Director Banks, one thought was, her preference was to keep, if we wanted to reduce the dilution and focus equity, she was wondering whether the jobs and economic prosperity one maybe goes away, and health and equity, because those are kind of our twin pillars. And we have data that tells us about equity, right? We see disproportionate, health outcomes for different populations, for example. So, I think there's, that's one way that you can put numbers, behind it. But part of it, I'm really feeling the lack of having, an SSG type resource available to us, or a health economist, for example, and others who, have that thinking and technical knowledge about the how, not the how that you're talking about through program implementation, which I get, but and so I was discussing with her, and we'd have to go back and say it, but again, if you end up integrating equity into the jobs and health measures, is that another way to get at this if there's some concern about not being able to put a number or have a clear criteria for equity? I guess I don't want to concede that there's not a way to do that. I think we haven't had the benefit of technical expertise for this part of the conversation the way the SSG has been able to support the other parts of the conversation. So just a discomfort with making any pronouncement here, or conceding that, yeah, that's right, we just have to do it through the implementation part. Just don't feel comfortable.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So when I was thinking about it, and I don't know, I can't pull out one of the actions, but if we have 70% of homes have heat pumps, that's the action that we would be ranking. You would need that, and we're going to target these types of households. And, perhaps we could put that into the list of actions. So rather than just leave it, 100% of new sales of EVs by 2035, we could add that everywhere, or we could just describe that as we want all of these programs to be designed in ways that address the equity issue. So to me, it is in the narrative that we would produce, and it would be in kind of a follow-on, here's how you would go about doing that with all these different policies.
Just to build on that, the second one down on the left, efficient heat pumps, 100% of new homes, and then later existing building, 100% heat pumps. You're going to do all of them, right? So it's 100% of homes get heat pumps. If that's the case, then everybody gets a heat pump. Then the question, so that's the what, but how you do it could be very different. And the commission can say, if we're going to have 100% heat pumps, for instance, the way to deal with equity is the first programs out of the gate should deal with low income people. Let's get them all done first, get them done, and then go to other people that can afford it if they can. But then that equity concern about underserved communities and other populations can be dealt with in the how part, because we're going to do all of them. It's just a matter of how do we get to them all? And that's the part of where the commission can weigh in terms of the how part, but that's not whether or not it gets included in the what part of the Tigger analysis.
But where it falls in the priority list does get decided from the get-go, right?
Yeah,
So
that's this metric.
Yeah,
equity.
so that's why, how can we reflect that now, understanding that the goal is 100%, but we're going to do this first, even though it isn't the cheapest, metric ton cost to do it because of these other equity concerns. And also the other thing that we don't have the resources to capture is, for the state as a whole, if we are concerned about state resources, we're avoiding health burden costs, right, to the rest of the state. So when we think about what legislators are thinking about and what they might support more, if we say, and by the way, Oregon health plan costs are going to be reduced by, X amount. If we had that technical capability, that provides the whole context for them for supporting a particular action. And that's what I'm struggling with, that we don't have the chops we have the brain power all here, but that it's a particular technical expertise to weave.
We actually did get the health benefit cost reduction as part of the analysis that we have already. So that was part of our considerations at the last meeting.
But if it was overall health through like the COBRA model, for example, it's just on average reducing, heart attacks, et cetera, overall health costs. But for the state itself, the state pays for the Oregon health plan, right?
Good point.
So that's the population that both on an equity count and for the state of Oregon's priorities would be the thing to weight.
So if you go back to the slide about the equity, and maybe Ariana can chime in on this more eloquently than I can. What would be helpful is for us staff that's going to be doing this. So it's going to be, this is another one of those professional judgment calls. Which ones of these programs are going to be able to serve underserved populations and communities? It'd be helpful to have kind of conversation about how that, since we don't have that technical analysis anytime soon, how do we go about evaluating that in this context? I mean, energy burden we can actually quantify, but and Commissioner Magniera's hand is up.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think this really speaks to what Gabriela is saying around like this kind of spreading equity out rather than having like a single metric, because usually the way, say, environmental justice communities are defined through mapping processes, it's evaluating health burdens, it's evaluating cost burdens, and it's evaluating economic burdens. So addressing how those burdens get lifted and benefits get created through those other categories is a good proxy for equity. Of course, when you take out a specific equity metric and kind of de-silo that, the conversation we're already having around how do you make sure it doesn't get lost along the way and gets deprioritized or kind of smoothed out, I think is the bigger question and concern. And I think we would be, or I would be very supportive of thinking about how to prioritize for any of those particular programs, because you are going to have the most potential for benefit when you prioritize the communities who have the highest energy burden, who have the biggest health risks and highest health costs, who have the biggest economic burdens. Like that benefit is there. Where you will run into some trouble is on the cost effectiveness side, because it is not always cost effective to provide the most benefit for communities. And so that's one thing to consider. And in general, why when I eventually do my homework, apologies for not having done it yet, I will vote in favor of really underweighting the cost effectiveness side and kind of overweighting on the equity side, just from the perspective of if we provide maximum benefit, it's going to conflict with cost effectiveness, and cost effectiveness in my experience working at Verde in the energy sector can lead to a lot of things not getting done for communities because it is not always cost effective through the models that exist. There are not good community benefit models. And this is an opportunity to build a community benefit model for a lens for policy. And I would encourage this commission to be bolder in that regard. I also just want to make one other note, which is that I would support maybe turning this equity category into more of like a cost burden category, and whomever recommended broadening that definition to not just be focused on energy burden, but on transportation, housing, to the extent that that's possible in this analysis. I think that's very important, especially because I also support ensuring that underserved communities does include rural or more remote or frontier communities, because that is part of our environmental justice definition, or communities definition at the state level, and very specifically so because those communities face some of our worst burdens from a climate perspective. And on the cost side, are most likely to face increases in transportation costs depending on what some of the policy choices are. So it's not just about showing who's going to benefit the most, but also showing, are there policies that might create undue burdens on communities where folks are driving more, where it's harder to switch to EVs. Like some of those transportation policies are not well designed from a rural community perspective. And this analysis, like including that additional cost burden piece, I think may help to show, and including that analysis and the actions will help to create a better benefits and burdens analysis, which is what I've kind of been harping on throughout this process. So it's great to be here in this conversation, but I hope that we can really get this right and really focus on the how do we make sure that Oregon's communities are benefiting, and in particular, those communities who often get left behind in policymaking.
Thank you, Commissioner Magniara. I
And
am
just
going
as a point of definition, energy burden includes fuels, electricity, and natural gas. So it's all energy types when we talk about that.
Okay, that's a helpful clarification, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it only includes that kind of energy utility burden, but I think that cost piece is important as well on the housing side, in particular, because a lot of people can afford a house in theory, or that they're renting, or an apartment or other home, just based on the rent. But then if the utility bill is very significant, that raises their total housing cost burden quite significantly, oftentimes outside of what people can afford. So those interactions are really important, and just kind of focusing in one area, like disaggregating even cost burden to transportation burden, again, is really important from a rural perspective. And then that housing and like energy utility costs, I think may need to be disaggregated as well, or because that total cost burden is one factor that's very important, but those individual pieces show a little bit more nuance in terms of how policies have impacts.
Thank you. I am going to recommend, given the time and the depth of the conversation that we've been having, which has been great, that the commission approve establishment of a subcommittee to work further on this, that we direct staff to pull together notes from this meeting to kind of reflect what we've talked about. I'm going to suggest that we take OHA up on their offer to help us think about the best way to approach the health costs piece, and that we try and come back to the next commission meeting with an updated proposal that tries to reflect all of the good thinking that we've had here today, as well as some follow-on. And I would like to reach out to a small handful of commissioners to participate in that subcommittee. How do people see that as an option for the path forward?
So this is Commissioner Ford. I fully support that proposal.
Great, thank you.
This is Commissioner Apter. I think that seems like a good path forward. And also would just support maybe getting some, I imagine we'll get some additional full commission meetings on the calendar, but we're working towards a deadline that's coming up here. So maybe if we need to add some holds that we don't end up using, or just something to make sure we continue to move the conversation forward, I would be supportive of that.
Great, thank you. Yes, that is what I want to do next, is kind of switch to the conversation of what we what the next sorry, I'm trying to read notes from Zach, and try and look at what's coming at us next and all the decisions that we're going to need to make. and how we're going to get that work done. I feel like we've gotten a lot of food for thought, and that pulling it together and then having a subcommittee, we could probably come up with a good, if not a final proposal, maybe here's most of what we've got, and we've got these two issues that are still uncertain.
One clarification, Chair McDonald. So if we did that in the near term, trying to keep on schedule, I think it's very important to try to get this report out before the next legislative session, and pushing out weeks would put that in danger. If we could have the subcommittee work with on coming up with a proposal in the near term, that would still allow staff to then try to score it for the next meeting and present that proposal, and we could and see if there's any modifications at the next meeting as an alternative proposal.
Well, I wasn't proposing that we push it out. I think we do need to do it as quickly as possible. Maybe it was the summary of the meeting minutes that you were worried about taking too much time.
I was worried about having enough time to score and rank them for the next meeting of the commission. And if we don't do the subcommittee work quickly, it would put that in jeopardy.
Agreed. Yeah, I think we need to expedite this and have a meeting where we really try and walk through all the things we've just talked about and come up with a proposal. Okay, so I heard some concurrence on that as a path forward. I will I will reach out to a few of the commissioners. If you're particularly interested in participating, let me know. To Alan's point, we would probably need to get something on the books early next week in order to try and work through all this together. So with that, Zach, can we go ahead and pull up the slide of the timeline? And then do you want to walk through it? Do you want me to walk through it, Zach?
Sure, I'm happy to walk through it, Chair McDonald. I think given the next steps that we just discussed, we might need to also think about shifting potentially here. I think the intention was this was put together with the idea that we would come out of this current meeting with the setup criteria, agreed upon criteria and the like, and then we were going to give about a week or so for folks to provide some written comments on the next step in the process, which is to start thinking about the recommendations that would go into the final report. We really haven't had a chance to start discussing those. So we were interested in getting initial comments from the public and commissioners about what type of recommendations. For example, we've been talking about a scenario that would accelerate the 2035 goal to 2030. And so that raises the question, is that what the commission would like to recommend moving forward? And then should there be a consideration about maybe the 2050 goal as well? Some of those types of questions are what we were interested in hearing from you all. And then staff and the chair, we were going to go back together and think about, use that input to draft some recommendations, which we would then post for public comment. With those draft recommendations, we were thinking we would post the scoring results from the evaluation criteria. If we are able to make that happen in the next couple of weeks, we can do that. I think we'll just have to think about exactly how that timeline will work. And then we were hoping to get written comments on the scoring results and draft recommendations, and then have a commission meeting kind of mid-November to discuss the scoring results and the draft recommendations and all the comments received at that point. Provide another opportunity for written comments based on that conversation. And then we'd have a commission meeting in early December to finalize the recommendations. If one of those recommendations included an interest in modeling another scenario, or a subset of the actions that are in the current scenarios, we would SSG would be able to help with that one piece. And I think the idea there being it would be more kind of the commission coming to a sense of, hey, these are the actions that we would like to move forward, and then we would just want to get the buttoned up numbers on the cost savings and the like for those for that bundle of actions that the commission wants to move forward. And then to Alan's point earlier, there's interest in delivering the report to the legislature before the legislative session. We'd be pushing for a deadline to get it delivered by January 9th, a week or so before the session starts. So that was the general outline of next steps. And again, we'll take the information and discussion that was that occurred this morning and think about where we might need to adjust or not.
Thank you, Zach. Any questions or comments from commission members? Let's see if anybody has a raised hand. I am feeling somewhat torn myself between wanting to make that deadline and provide something that hopefully would be useful to legislators in considering how they develop out policy ideas during the long session, with not wanting to shortchange the final report writing. So I'm feeling a little torn on that myself, but do think the faster we can keep moving, the better, with a recognition that this is a 1.0 version, and that we can identify some of the maybe missing elements or things that we think need to happen as follow-on to best inform policy deliberations. But I'd love to hear if other commissioners have a different thought about priorities for expedience versus quality. Or I won't say quality, but you know what I mean. Completeness, maybe. Commissioner Magnera.
Yeah, I feel like considerations for communities, especially environmental justice communities, are often kind of pitted against timelines. And so I just want to name that that's a constant issue that we deal with in the work that Verde does. But that we often find as an organization, and I find in my work, that slowing down, you save in the long run in terms of those upfront time you spend ensuring that you get things right and you include the right people in conversations and you weigh the benefits and burdens. That leads to fewer unintended consequences on the back end, and also more durability to the kinds of policies you look at, because you know that they're providing benefits and they're not creating unintended consequences along the way. So at least from my perspective, I don't want to put undue pressure on staff, but I think the more we can kind of spend even just a week or two meeting and getting this right, not as a whole commission, but as you mentioned, a subcommittee, I think that could have a lot of value to just tweaking a little bit, bringing it back to the full commission. And it doesn't have to be a really long detour, but kind of a slight stop may help to make sure that this has the impacts we intended to.
Thank you, Commissioner Magnera. Commissioner Ford.
Thank you, Chair McDonald. I appreciate Commissioner Magnera's comments and support them. I mean, I too am torn at this time frame, and I guess one of the things we should consider is maybe talking with the legislature or the key committee folks to see kind of what's the, you know, the latest we could deliver a report that still would be useful to the legislature. My sense is that by January 9th, it's not such a critical date to the legislature, that rather, you know, a date 30 or even 45 days later might not have that much of an impact in the ability for the legislature to take this input and incorporate it into their processes. I also would, you know, also we could urge the legislature to also do some outreach and invite the various communities that Commissioner McNair was referring to as part of the input process, as the legislature defines this a bit too. So, you know, I think it's worth taking the time to do this right, and at least recognizing it's a 1.0 version. But let's try to answer as many questions as we can, because I think that would be the most useful to the legislature. And I know we have some legislators on the line, and I'd be curious what their comments might be on that thought.
This is Commissioner Apter. I just want to weigh in. I think Commissioner Ford's recommendations are a good approach. I think it would be helpful to have input from legislators. And in addition, also just want to underscore, I think we all recognize, you know, the sooner the better in terms of being able to inform policy recommendations. And I just reflecting on some of the conversations we've had throughout this you know, many month process, I think we've recognized this roadmap will be an ever evolving product. And so I do think that there is the ability for us to include language in the report, you know, reflecting where there are still questions and where we want to encourage legislators to do their due diligence and ensuring that there is input from communities being taken into strong consideration as they develop legislation for the 2023 session. And I'm sure there are other areas in the report as well where we want to make sure that we're very clear in terms of, you know, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act, that we recognize we may not be able to incorporate cost savings from investments. You know, I think there are a number of other examples where we can be clear in the report language that this is a work in progress. These are, you know, the Commission's recommendations based on the information and the analysis that we've done to date. So I think we can hopefully take a both and approach and try to stick as closely as possible to our timeline.
Thank you, Commissioner Apter. I like the idea of maybe reaching out to the appropriate committees and asking what ledge concepts they think are going to be coming their way, and prioritizing maybe some of our input to them based on what's going to be most relevant for the legislative session. And if that means, you know, doing some kind of a PowerPoint on relevant elements, we can do that, and maybe just take a little bit longer. But I'll check in with staff at Odo and maybe have conversations with some of you and come back with a clear path forward. Gabriella?
Yeah, just similar to the discussions of the Inflation Reduction Act, things that are coming down the pike. Oregon just got a $2 billion Medicaid waiver that allows the first state in the country that is going to be able to use Medicaid dollars to pay for heat pumps and, you know, other climate resilience related investments. So that's, you know, another example. So I'm wondering, is the version 1 what the Commission can say with confidence based on the work supported by SSG, and identifying what the gaps are that the Commission may want to seek more resources and have more of that community engagement or a lab analysis of existing community engagement. So it's centering, here's what we know so far, here's what's missing to give you the full picture. We'll be coming back to you with that. But if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll be starting to get at, you know, things that we know are going to make a difference.
Thank you. Very good point. Excellent. I'm going to move us along to our final agenda item. I think we committed to being done at 12:45. Zach, will you remind me, or was that, or did everybody commit to 1 o'clock?
We had it scheduled to 1 o'clock. I think that was optimistic hope that we would be done by 12:45.
Okay, well, I still think we should probably move on. And give you an update on the Natural and Working Lands project. And first, I want to thank Commissioners Reitman, Ford, and Apter for joining me in reviewing 47 proposals that we got from Oregonians who were interested in helping us with this project. But just to step back for a second, the project got launched in July. We were able to complete contracts, or the Institute for Natural Resources was able to complete contracts with the 2 funders, the U.S. Climate Alliance and NRCS. They recruited and hired a facilitator who's started working. We already have a draft scope of work for a workforce and training study that is getting some technical review, and then will be taken up by the advisory committee very soon. The facilitator has created a standalone website for the project, so that people can go and keep track of all the meeting materials and information. And so that'll be a real helpful way for folks to stay in touch with the project. And the Institute for Natural Resources has already begun engaging technical experts to inform the recommendations related to the inventory improvements and the activity metrics. So a lot of movement there, which is great. As I mentioned, we had a subcommittee. We ultimately got 47 applications at the commission's last meeting. We agreed to extend the time period for application to try and fill some of the gaps that we had in coverage of the state. And we did get some additional folks in that represented some different areas. So that was helpful. We did want to keep the number below 30 so that it could be manageable and we could have good conversations. And so we went through all 47 applications and then really thought and evaluated the distribution and the areas of expertise that different people brought to the table. Next slide, please. And just a reminder of the process, we did extend it, as I mentioned. These are the qualifications that we were looking at and that we were weighing against all of the people who applied, trying to do an assessment based on their application materials of how they might be able to really contribute to a cohesive group of people. Next slide, please. It won't take time for you to read the long list. We'll get this posted probably today or Monday or Tuesday, I guess, if it's not already posted. As I mentioned, we've got 27 people, and while the meetings themselves won't be public meetings, we will record all the meetings and the meeting minutes, and all of that will be posted on that website that our consultants developed. I'm excited about the people that have stepped forward who want to participate in helping us advance this project. And then just the final slide. This is just some screenshots of the standalone web page. We will link it back to our Natural and Working Lands page, which I think we need to do a little updating, and then we can make sure that they link back to each other. The URL is Oregon Global Warming Commission Natural and Working Lands.org. So easy for you to find, and you can scroll around and see some of the base materials that have been developed already about what we're trying to do and how we're trying to approach it. So again, thank you to the subcommittee that helped evaluate the applications. And I just want to also mention that we will be updating the commission as the advisory committee starts to develop out and make recommendations for the commission's consideration on the deliverables that we have. And so there will definitely be opportunity for public comment at commission meetings on the specifics of the information that's being pulled together. Any questions? Any reflections from others on the subcommittee?
This is Commissioner Reitman. I'd just like to reiterate that we had a lot of outstanding applicants, and I think it's going to be a really good subcommittee to help us. Looking forward to the results.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Ford. I would support the comments of Commissioner Reitman. I mean, there were a lot of great candidates, and I'm very very confident that the group that was identified will help us achieve the objectives we're trying to achieve with this work group. So I have to say, though, Chair McDonald, when I first got the spreadsheet and all the application material, I was a bit overwhelmed at the quantity of information that we needed to sift through to come to a conclusion. But I would also commend you for keeping the subgroup on task, and I thought it was a very positive, collaborative approach that we used to get to the final result. So thank you for your leadership on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Ford. Any questions? Others or other comments? Well, with that, I will close the October 7th meeting of the Oregon Global Warming Commission. And I will confer with staff and then be reaching out to some of you to participate in the subcommittee. Do let me know if it's something you're particularly interested in, and just shoot me an email, and then but we'll kind of confer about what that work plan looks like and try and get that out to folks that are interested, and to folks that I'm going to voluntold to participate. Voluntold, I guess. So anyway, thanks to everyone again for the great comments. Good identification of resources to help with the roadmap, and good thinking about that, and look forward to next steps on both. Thank you.
Thank you.